Your baby won't stop crying. You have a factory shift in 45 minutes. You have 4 other children. You have no husband, or the husband you have isn't helping. You have a bottle on the shelf that costs 1 penny. 1 penny for the whole bottle. You give the baby a spoonful. The crying stops. The baby goes very quiet. You go to work. You come home 8 hours later. The baby is still very quiet. This happened thousands of times in Georgian and Victorian London. The bottle was called Godfrey's Cordial, or Daffy's Elixir, or Street's infant Quietness. What was in it, in every case, was laudanum opium dissolved in alcohol. What killed those babies was the same substance that poets were writing about in Ecstasy, that pharmacists were selling across the counter without a prescription. The doctors were prescribing for headaches, for menstrual pain, for nerves, for insomnia, for coughs, for diarrhoea, for the general condition of being alive in a difficult century. The baby died of the same thing that made Thomas de Quincey the most celebrated literary figure in England. The same thing that Wilkie Collins used so heavily. He wrote what became the first modern detective novel, and later remembered nothing about writing it. The same thing that killed Elizabeth Siddal, pre-Raphaelite muse, while her husband slept beside her. The same thing that a working-class mother in Whitechapel and a poet in a Mayfair townhouse were both consuming at the same time with the same pharmacological effect, in a world that had no word yet for what was happening to them. The word didn't exist, but the thing itself was everywhere. Godfrey's Cordial, the baby killer that won the Empire's approval. The advertisement read, "For the relief of infants during teething, also for coughs, colds and restlessness." Godfrey's Cordial was first produced in the early 18th century and remained in widespread use until the late 19th. It contained opium, sometimes listed as laudanum, sometimes as tincture of opium, sometimes simply not listed at all, suspended in treacle and water, flavored with sassafras to make it sweet enough for a baby to swallow without objection. It worked exactly as advertised. Infants in pain from teething stopped crying. Infants with coughs went quiet. Infants who were restless slept. The mothers, the nurses, the baby farmers who used it got the silence they needed. The employers who demanded their workers show up, regardless of childcare arrangements, got productive workers. The economy of industrial Britain ran, in part, on the quieted bodies of opiated children. A medical survey conducted in Nottingham in the 1840s found that nearly 3/4 of working-class mothers surveyed regularly dosed their infants with some form of opium preparation, Godfrey's Cordial being the most common. The surveyors noted this without significant alarm. It was ordinary. It was how things were done. What the mothers often didn't know, and what the manufacturers certainly knew and chose not to advertise, was that opium is particularly dangerous to infants. An adult's liver can metabolize the drug relatively efficiently. An infant's liver cannot. The margin between a sedating dose and a lethal dose in a small child is narrow enough that any miscalculation, a slightly larger spoonful, a slightly more concentrated bottle, an infant slightly smaller than average could be fatal. The deaths were recorded as overlaying, a common cause of infant death in the period, meaning the mother had accidentally smothered the child in her sleep. Some of them were. Many of them were something else. An inquest would find an infant cold in its crib, still blue-tinged. The Godfrey's Cordial bottle on the shelf. Charges. The coroner noted, overlaying, and moved on. One Nottingham physician, Dr. John Whittaker, calculated in 1868 that Godfrey's Cordial was directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of children per year in his district alone. He was describing, in careful medical language, a mass poisoning invisible to the society conducting it. The word poisoning wasn't used. This was medicine. Legitimate, commercially available, physician-adjacent medicine. The bottle had a label. You bought it at a chemist's. Mothers who used it weren't doing something shameful or hidden. They were doing what any reasonable person did when their baby was sick or inconvenient or simply too loud for the demands of the world they were living in. The opium didn't care about the label. It entered the infant's blood, crossed the blood-brain barrier, depressed the respiratory center in the brainstem, and if the dose was high enough and the child small enough, the breathing slowed and slowed and stopped, quietly, without drama, in a way that looked, in a darkened room, exactly like sleep. And across the city, in a Mayfair drawing room, a poet was taking his evening dose of the same substance, chasing the same neurological effect and calling it transcendence. What laudanum actually was, liquid morphine in a bottle. The name comes from the Latin laudare, to praise. Thomas Sydenham, the 17th century English physician who did more than anyone to popularize its use, called it laudanum, a medicine worthy of praise. He prescribed it for almost everything. He is sometimes called the English Hippocrates. He was also, by modern standards, running one of the largest involuntary opioid distribution operations in medical history. Laudanum was simple to make and difficult to adulterate badly enough to destroy its effectiveness. You took raw opium, the dried sap of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, and dissolved it in alcohol. The standard preparation that became dominant by the 18th century was approximately 10% opium by weight in alcohol, though concentrations varied wildly between manufacturers and even between batches from the same manufacturer. What this means chemically is that laudanum was a solution containing morphine, codeine, thebaine, papaverine, and a dozen other alkaloids suspended in alcohol. The active component, the one responsible for pain relief, euphoria, and addiction, was primarily morphine. A standard dose of laudanum delivered roughly the same pharmacological effect as a moderate dose of morphine. In other words, laudanum was liquid morphine, readily available. Commercially sold, no prescription required. Purchased by the bottle at any chemist's shop in England, available through the mail from catalogues, stocked in household medicine chests alongside smelling salts and tooth powder, given to babies and grandmothers and anxious men and invalid women and anyone whose body was causing them trouble. The dose varied by age, by complaint, by the practitioner's or self-prescriber's estimate of what was needed. A typical adult dose for pain relief was between 10 and 30 drops, roughly half to 1.5 teaspoons. An experienced addict like Thomas de Quincey was eventually taking something in the range of 8,000 drops per day. That is not a misprint. 8,000 drops, roughly equivalent to 320 milligrams of morphine per day, a dose that would kill most opioid-naive adults several times over. De Quincey reached that level over decades. His tolerance built so gradually that each increment felt unremarkable. This is what opioid addiction does. It is not a cliff you fall off. It is a gentle slope on which each step feels like standing still. The alcohol in laudanum was not incidental. It served as preservative, as solvent, and as its own reinforcing substance, giving the preparation a dual mechanism of dependence. The laudanum addict was addicted to opioids and to alcohol simultaneously, though neither they nor their physicians had the conceptual framework to understand this clearly. Attempts to reduce the opium often involved switching to pure alcohol. Attempts to address the alcohol problem often involved opiates. The two addictions spiraled around each other like threads in a rope. What nobody in Georgian or early Victorian England had was the concept of addiction itself. The word addiction in its modern sense, a compulsive, physiological dependency characterized by tolerance and withdrawal, didn't exist. What existed was the observation that some people seemed unable to stop taking laudanum even when they wanted to. This was explained in moral terms: weakness of character, insufficient will. The disease model of addiction, in which the brain's reward circuitry is physically altered by repeated drug exposure, was a century away. In the absence of this framework, the addicted person was simply someone who kept making a bad choice. Every day, they chose the laudanum again. Every day, they failed to stop. The failure was theirs. The laudanum was medicine. The pharmacist who sold it like aspirin walk into any chemist's shop in London in 1800 and ask for laudanum. The transaction will be brief. The chemist will reach to the shelf behind him, where the laudanum sits in its brown bottle alongside paregoric, a weaker opium preparation, Godfrey's Cordial for infants, Dover's powder, opium and ipecac, and various proprietary preparations whose exact compositions are the trade secret of their manufacturers. He will measure out what you've asked for, or sell you the whole bottle. He will ask no questions about why you want it. He will note the sale in his ledger, not for legal reasons, but for accounting. He will hand you the bottle, take your penny or your shilling, and turn to the next customer. There was no prescription requirement for laudanum in England until 1868. And even then, the Pharmacy Act that imposed limited restrictions was weakly enforced and riddled with exceptions. The chemist's recording requirement, a simple note in a poison register, was the only formal control. Anybody could walk in, state their name, give any address they chose, and leave with as much laudanum as they could pay for. The reasons for this complete lack of restriction were not negligence or ignorance. They were philosophical. The medical and social consensus of Georgian and early Victorian England held that adults were capable of managing their own drug use, that opiates were medicines with well-understood effects, if not yet well-understood mechanisms, and that government intervention in the individual's medical choices was inappropriate. This was the same ideological framework that made gin shops acceptable in the early 18th century, and that produced the gin craze that killed tens of thousands of Londoners. The difference was that gin was visibly destructive in obvious ways. The Hogarth prints of Gin Lane, the bodies in the street, the visible moral collapse of the gin-soaked poor. Laudanum's destruction was quieter. The laudanum addict didn't fall down in the street. They retreated to their room. They wrote poetry, or didn't write it. They sat very still and felt nothing, or felt something so large they couldn't describe it. They died in beds, in private, in ways that looked like illness rather than intoxication. The invisibility of laudanum addiction made it easy to keep laudanum visible on the pharmacist's shelf. The chemist who sold it was not the villain. He was a professional dispensing a recognized medicine with genuine therapeutic applications. Opium preparations genuinely reduced pain, genuinely suppressed coughs, genuinely calmed the anxious and the grieving. In a world without aspirin, without antibiotics, without any of the analgesic and anti-inflammatory drugs we now take for granted, laudanum was the most effective tool in the medical toolbox for a huge range of conditions. The person buying it was not a fool. They bought it because it worked, because their tooth stopped aching, because their dysentery became manageable, because the grief after their child died became, for a few hours, something they could bear, and because it worked, they came back. Thomas de Quincey, the man who took 8,000 drops a day. He first took laudanum in 1804 when he was 19 years old for a toothache. This is the part of Thomas de Quincey's story that sounds like a cautionary tale, and is one, but also isn't quite one. Because by the time he took that first dose, he had already built several years of experiences that made him exactly the kind of person for whom opium would be catastrophic. He had run away from Manchester Grammar School at 16, wandered Wales and London in poverty for months, nearly starved, slept on the streets of Oxford Street with a 15-year-old prostitute named Anne, who fed him scraps of food and vanished from his life one afternoon, and whom he spent decades looking for and never found. He was a person full of grief and difficulty before opium ever touched him. Opium didn't create the wound. It filled it. The toothache resolved. The opium remained. He found that it made him feel. And here, we need his own words, because nobody before or since has described it as precisely a panacea for all human woes. Not in the exaggerated sense of a satisfied customer. In the specific pharmacological sense of a man who had spent his adolescence in a state of low-grade misery, discovering that there was a substance that made misery temporarily impossible. For the first years of his use, de Quincey was what we would now call a functional addict. He took laudanum on Tuesdays. He described this specificity with retrospective black humor, and the rest of the week was his own. He was at Oxford. He was reading Greek. He was developing the literary and philosophical mind that would eventually make him famous. The Tuesday doses were a pleasure he looked forward to, and a secret he kept. But tolerance is the inescapable physics of opioid use. The dose that produced euphoria becomes the dose that produces normality. The dose that produced normality becomes the dose that merely prevents withdrawal. And the dose that merely prevents withdrawal must grow constantly, because withdrawal from opioids is not an abstraction. It is a physical experience that de Quincey would spend decades describing in prose of extraordinary precision. By the time he wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821, he was taking what he calculated as 8,000 drops of laudanum per day. He spent the months before writing the book trying in extraordinary physical agony to reduce his dose to manageable levels. The Confessions is simultaneously a memoir of pleasure and a document of physiological torment. The two experiences so interwoven that separating them becomes philosophically impossible. The Confessions made him famous. It also made laudanum famous. Or rather, it made laudanum literary, sophisticated, intellectual, the substance of a certain kind of elevated sensibility rather than a dirty habit of the degraded. De Quincey's brilliant prose performed a kind of laundering operation on opium addiction that persisted in cultural imagination for the rest of the century. To be an opium eater was to be, potentially, a person of extraordinary inner life. The suffering was the price of the transcendent. This was, of course, a lie, but it was a beautiful lie, elegantly constructed, and beautiful lies are always more durable than ugly truths. The pleasures, why it felt good. Before we talk about what laudanum destroyed, we need to talk about why it was taken, not in the moralistic sense of explaining the sinner's temptation, in the pharmacological sense of explaining what was actually happening in the brain and body of someone who took it, so that the hold it acquired makes sense as something other than weakness or foolishness. Opioids work by binding to specific receptors in the brain and body, the mu, delta, and kappa opioid receptors that are part of the brain's natural pain modulation and reward system. These receptors exist because the brain produces its own opioid-like substances, endorphins, enkephalins, dynorphins. When you exercise intensely enough to feel a runner's high, your brain is releasing endorphins that bind to these same receptors. When a mother holds her newborn infant and feels overwhelming calm and love, part of that feeling is endorphin-mediated. The opioid system is ancient, evolutionarily conserved, and fundamental to how mammals experience pleasure and pain. Laudanum morphine binds to these same receptors with far greater affinity than the brain's own endorphins. The effect is therefore far more powerful than any natural experience can provide. Pain, physical pain, emotional pain, the low-grade background suffering of a difficult life simply disappears. The anxious mind goes still. The muscles relax entirely. The constant internal noise of consciousness settles. What remains is a warmth, an ease, a feeling that everything is, right now, fundamentally all right. De Quincey described it as the abyss of divine enjoyment. The poet-physician John Keats, who also knew laudanum well, wrote of an indolent and supremely blissful repose. The novelist Wilkie Collins described the onset of the drug as heavenly coolness stealing over him. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who took laudanum for decades for a respiratory condition and the nerves that afflicted her as a young woman, described a state of peace. Peace. None of them were exaggerating for dramatic effect. They were accurately describing a pharmacological state that their brains were experiencing. The problem wasn't that laudanum didn't do what it appeared to do. The problem was that it did exactly what it appeared to do, and that the price of that experience was paid over years, and the bill arrived in withdrawal. For someone living in Georgian London, in a world of high physical pain from toothache, rheumatism, injury, and the diseases of poverty and filth, in a world of high emotional pain from child mortality, economic precarity, domestic violence, and the general grinding difficulty of survival, the availability of a substance that made all of this briefly stop was not a matter of casual temptation. It was a profound, rational response to real suffering. This is the aspect of laudanum addiction that contemporaries couldn't understand, and that we still sometimes refuse to. The drug worked. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't stupidity. It was a temporary, purchased, eventually catastrophic solution to real and legitimate suffering. The architecture of addiction. How laudanum trapped people. The trap didn't close all at once. That's the thing about opioid tolerance that makes it so different from other forms of self-destruction. If you drink too much gin in a single evening, you are sick immediately. The punishment is swift and obvious. The association between the substance and the suffering is immediate. Your body makes the connection, and while this doesn't always prevent continued use, at least the mechanism is clear. With laudanum, the punishment was deferred, sometimes for years. You began with a dose that brought relief and pleasure. That dose continued to bring relief and pleasure for weeks, perhaps months. Then, gradually, it brought only relief, the pleasure component having faded as tolerance developed. Then it brought only normality, the absence of withdrawal, which itself felt like relief only because you no longer remembered what not needing the drug had felt like. And then, finally, it didn't even bring normality unless you increased the dose. At no point in this process did taking the drug feel like a bad decision. Every dose felt like the right choice, because every dose was preventing something worse, the withdrawal that now awaited anyone who tried to stop. The withdrawal from opioids was described by Victorian physicians with a clinical precision that nonetheless failed to convey the lived experience, and by addicts themselves with a visceral accuracy that no clinical language could contain. De Quincey wrote of the pains of opium as a separate entity from the pleasure's a monster that lived on the far side of the pleasure and collected its toll. He described lying awake for nights while his body produced what he called a Iliad of woe, a continuous, elaborate, terrible suffering that his mind was forced to experience without any of the analytical distance he could ordinarily apply to experience. The physical symptoms of opioid withdrawal that Georgian physicians and addicts described, and that we now understand in precise physiological terms, are intense muscle cramps and spasms, the cold turkey phenomenon, where the skin goes gooseflesh and the muscles cramp involuntarily, uncontrollable sweating alternating with chill, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhoea, insomnia so complete that the sufferer cannot fall asleep, regardless of physical exhaustion, anxiety so severe it approaches acute psychosis, and a form of restless agitation, sometimes called akathisia, in which the sufferer cannot remain still but gains no relief from movement. This lasts between 5 and 10 days for the acute phase. Afterward, for weeks or months, there is a post-acute withdrawal syndrome characterized by anhedonia. the inability to feel any pleasure at all, because the brain's natural opioid system has been so thoroughly supplanted by exogenous opioids that it has down-regulated its own production. The world becomes grey. Food tastes of nothing. Sleep brings no rest. All motivation evaporates. For someone in this state, taking more laudanum was not a decision. It was the only conceivable action. The physical hell of withdrawal. What De Quincey actually went through. In the winter of 1812, Thomas De Quincey attempted to stop. He was 26 years old, living at Grasmere in the Lake District, and he had been taking laudanum for 8 years. He had convinced himself, as all addicts convince themselves, that this time would be different, that the dose he had allowed himself to reach was still within manageable bounds, that the withdrawal would be an unpleasantness and not a catastrophe. He was wrong. He described what followed in the confessions with the particular courage of a man who was simultaneously traumatized and intellectually fascinated by his own experience. He writes of days and nights compressed and distorted, of time itself becoming unreliable. He writes of a sweating so intense that he seemed to himself to be dissolving. He writes of cramps that gathered in waves through his legs and abdomen, a crawling, scraping sensation that no position could relieve, that woke him from the brief scraps of sleep he managed to claim, that made lying still feel impossible and moving feel equally impossible. He writes, most hauntingly, of the dreams. During withdrawal, the brain's suppressed REM sleep comes flooding back in what is called REM rebound, an intense, uncontrollable surge of dreaming that produces nightmares of unusual vividness and frequency. For De Quincey, already prone to elaborate and architectural inner imagery, these dreams were overwhelming. He describes recurring visions of vast crowds, of buildings that grew to impossible scale, of faces that assembled out of shadow and looked at him with expressions he could not name. The dreams felt more real than waking life, and waking life felt less real than the dreams. He did not successfully stop in 1812. He reduced his dose, partially, for a period. Then he increased it again, then reduced it. This oscillation attempt, partial success, relapse, attempt again, would define the next 60 years of his life. What's important to understand is that this was not failure of will in any meaningful sense. The pharmacology of opioid withdrawal is not a matter of willpower overcoming desire. It is a matter of a nervous system that has been physically reorganized by years of drug exposure, now attempting to function without the substance it has built its entire regulatory architecture around. Telling someone in opioid withdrawal to simply stop is like telling someone with a broken leg to walk normally. The instruction makes sense only if you don't understand the injury. De Quincey understood his injury better than almost anyone of his time. Understanding it didn't help him much with stopping, but it helped him write about it in terms that if his society had been capable of receiving them, should have reframed the entire discussion of laudanum from a moral to a medical one. His society was not yet capable of receiving them. That would take another century. Women and laudanum, the respectable addict. There is a remarkable asymmetry in how laudanum addiction was perceived in the 19th century, depending on the sex of the person addicted. A man who took too much laudanum and showed signs of dependency was a fallen man. Weak, perhaps. Unfortunate. Unfortunate, a subject for concern. But the fall was visible, identifiable, sometimes recoverable. He had made a choice, the wrong choice, repeatedly, and choices implied agency, and agency implied that reform was theoretically possible. A woman who took too much laudanum was ill. She was a patient. She was someone to whom things were happening. What? Her physicians were giving it to her for her nerves, for her hysteria, for her menstrual complaints, for the depression that followed childbirth, for the anxiety that attended middle age, for the grief that followed bereavement. She was not making a choice. She was receiving treatment. This distinction, man as agent, woman as patient, had profound consequences. It meant that a woman's laudanum addiction was, practically speaking, invisible. It was her normal medical condition. Her husband might notice that she was drowsier than usual, less present, less capable of managing the household. Her physician would prescribe more laudanum for her anxiety. The chemist would sell it without question. The cycle would continue. The statistics from the 19th century show that women were prescribed opiates at significantly higher rates than men. Victorian medicine had developed an entire theoretical framework centered on the concept of hysteria and the reflex irritation, supposedly transmitted from the uterus to the nervous system, to explain why women were constitutionally more prone to nervous complaints, pain and emotional instability, and therefore more in need of the sedation that laudanum provided. What this framework actually described, in physiological terms, was that women's lives in the 19th century were more constrained, more pain-laden, more controlled, and more lacking in agency than men's lives. and that laudanum temporarily resolved the tension between what women's lives required and what women's nervous systems could sustain. It was a pharmaceutical solution to a social problem. The invalid woman of Victorian literature lying on her sofa, pale, fragile, requiring constant rest and quiet, was often an opium addict. Her condition was medicalized and aestheticized simultaneously. Her fragility was perceived as refinement. Her pallor was interpreted as delicacy. The laudanum bottle beside her bed was as respectable as the Bible, and beneath this genteel surface, her nervous system was rebuilding itself around the drug with the same mechanical precision as De Quincey's, as the infants in the Godfrey's Cordial crib, as every person who had ever taken opioids long enough. There was no gentle middle-class version of opioid tolerance. The chemistry didn't know who it was dealing with. Elizabeth Siddal, death by respectable medicine. Lizzie Siddal was 20 when Dante Gabriel Rossetti first hired her to model for him in 1850. By the time she died, she was 32. She had been his wife for 2 years. She had recently lost a stillborn child, and the laudanum bottle beside her bed was not a new presence. She had been taking it for years, prescribed initially for neuralgia, a chronic facial pain condition, and for the lung condition that made her cough throughout her life. Whether the condition was tuberculosis or not is still debated by medical historians. What's not debated is that she was genuinely ill, that the pain was real, and that laudanum was what her doctors offered her for it. She was also a painter and a poet in her own right, overlooked by her century, recovered by later ones. Her paintings have an unsettling quality, slightly wrong in proportion and color in ways that feel intentional, that feel like they're seeing something ordinary life doesn't quite see. Her poems are spare and dark, and preoccupied with loss and death and waiting. She wrote them on the edges of sketches, in spare moments, in the gaps between sitting for Rossetti's paintings and being ill and being medicated back to something resembling functionality. On the night of 10 February 1862, Rossetti went out to dinner. Lizzie went to bed. When Rossetti returned, he found her unconscious. There was an empty laudanum bottle on the bedside table. There was also, reportedly, a note pinned to her nightgown. She died the following evening, without regaining consciousness. The note was burned. Rossetti said he burned it to protect her reputation. A laudanum overdose in 1862 implied suicide, and suicide was both a crime and a sin, and the scandal would have followed her into death and her family out of it. His solicitor agreed. The note was burned, and what it said, whether it was a final message, a confession, an accident's apology, a deliberate choice, was destroyed with it. The inquest returned a verdict of accidental death. Accidental laudanum poisoning in someone known to take it medicinally. Possible, plausible. The coroner chose to believe it. Rossetti did not believe it. He buried the notebook of his poems with her in her coffin, a grand romantic gesture that he later regretted enough to have her exhumed 7 years later to retrieve the notebook. He spent the rest of his life haunted by her death, in ways that his work makes visible to anyone who looks. She becomes Beata Beatrix. She becomes Proserpina. She becomes the woman descending into sleep, or death, or something between them, painted over and over by a man who never quite said what he was remembering. What she was is this: a woman prescribed laudanum for real physical pain, who took enough of it that the line between medicinal and lethal became, eventually, uncrossable. Whether she chose to cross it or fell across it without choosing is a question that died with the note. Wilkie Collins am a novel he didn't remember writing. There is a first edition copy of The Moonstone, published in 1868, that Wilkie Collins could barely look at in the later years of his life. Not because it wasn't good. Very good. Who-s. Eliot called it the first, the longest, and the best of modern English detective novels. It introduced the investigative techniques, multiple narrators, a reconstructed timeline, the solution hidden in plain sight that Conan Doyle and Christie and every subsequent crime writer would inherit. It is a foundational text of English literature. Collins wrote significant portions of it in a state of such profound laudanum intoxication that he later said he had no memory of writing them. He discovered what he'd written when he read the proofs. This was not hyperbole. Collins was, by the late 1860s, taking enough laudanum to stagger the imagination. His doctors had prescribed it for what he called rheumatic gout, a condition causing intense joint pain, and he had discovered that the dose required to manage the pain was a dose that also managed everything else. Anxiety, insomnia, the sense of general difficulty that attended his complicated domestic arrangements. He maintained 2 households with 2 women, and the emotional arithmetic of this life had costs that the laudanum also helped to pay. He was sometimes so heavily dosed that he would see a second Wilkie Collins standing in the room with him. He described this double visible, apparently solid, staring back at him with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who has largely made his peace with the bizarre. The double was, presumably, a hypnagogic hallucination produced by the laudanum. Collins treated it as an occupant of his house. His later novels, written under increasing doses with increasing difficulty, are notably uneven. Passages of brilliant construction alternate with passages of murk and repetition. His friends worried. His publishers worried. He continued to work, continued to take the laudanum, continued to produce fiction that ranged from extraordinary to confused. He died in 1889 at 65, having been addicted to laudanum for roughly 30 years. His doctor wrote that the opium habit had shortened his life, but also acknowledged that the pain Collins had been medicating was real and had been managed by nothing else available. This is the uncomfortable accounting of Victorian laudanum use. The drug that shortened his life may also have made the most productive years of it livable. The novel he didn't remember writing remains among the most celebrated crime novels in the English language. It begins with a theft of a diamond and a detective who notices things others miss. It was written by a man who, some mornings, couldn't find his shoes. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The Interrupted Dream. There is a poem that exists only because Coleridge woke up too soon. Or rather, there is a poem that exists in permanent incompletion because Coleridge was interrupted at the crucial moment and could never afterward recover what he had seen. In the summer of 1797, at a farmhouse in Somerset, Coleridge fell asleep after taking a preparation of opium prescribed for a dysenteric complaint. He later explained, though he had been using opium recreationally for long enough that the distinction between medical and recreational was already blurred. He slept for 3 hours and dreamed intensely, dreamed in complete and elaborate images that he experienced with the certainty of real vision. When he woke, he immediately began writing down what he had seen. He wrote 54 lines. Then a visitor arrived. A person on business from Porlock, he says, and detained him for an hour, and when he returned to the desk the vision had dissolved. He had a vivid sense that there had been 200 or 300 more lines, that the poem in the dream had been complete and structured and coherent, but the details were gone. He could see the shapes, but not the words. What remained became Kubla Khan, with a note explaining its circumstances. That is itself one of the most famous prefaces in English poetry. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan, a stately pleasure-dome decree. 54 lines of the most extraordinary imagery in the language. The sacred river, the caves of ice, the damsel with the dulcimer, the milk of paradise at the end, and then nothing. The poem stops, not at a conclusion, but at an interruption. Whether the vision came from opium is not certain. Coleridge had a visual imagination of extraordinary richness that predated his drug use. But what the opium did unambiguously, in ways he described in letters and notebooks with painful clarity, was eventually destroy his ability to write. Not all at once, over years. The drug that gave him, possibly, Kubla Khan and the rhyme of the ancient mariner in his early use, eventually paralyzed him. He described the creative paralysis in terms that exactly match what we now understand about opioid-induced anhedonia. The ideas came, but his ability to act on them dissolved. He would sit for hours before a blank page, knowing what he wanted to write, unable to make his hand form the words. The poetry that had poured through him in his 20s became, in his 30s and 40s, a trickle and then a silence. He spent the last 18 years of his life living with a physician, James Gilman, who managed his opium use and who noted with clinical precision the quantities being consumed. The management helped. Coleridge reduced somewhat. He wrote prose, brilliant, difficult, philosophical prose, but the poetry was mostly gone. He died in 1834 at 61. His friend Charles Lamb wrote, "He was my 50 years old friend without a dissension." He also had, without Lamb's awareness, spent roughly 40 of those years in varying degrees of opioid dependency. Kubla Khan was published posthumously in 1816 with its explanatory note about the dream and the interruption. The visitor from Porlock has become shorthand in literary culture for any interruption that destroys a fragile creative state. What's less often discussed is what produced the fragile creative state in the first place. The East India Company and the opium machine. The laudanum in every English household didn't come from nowhere. The opium that dissolved into those brown bottles came, primarily, from Bengal, from the vast poppy fields of northeastern India that the British East India Company had spent decades developing into the most profitable agricultural system in the empire. What happened in those fields was the other end of the same supply chain that put Godfrey's Cordial on the chemist's shelf and De Quincey's laudanum on his writing desk. The company's relationship with opium was simple in principle and vast in scale. It controlled the poppy cultivation in Bengal, purchased the raw opium from the farmers at monopoly prices. It set unilaterally, processed it into chests of prepared opium, and sold those chests at auction to private merchants who then shipped them to China. China was the destination because China was the market. And China was the market because the East India Company had spent several decades systematically creating it. Opium smoking had existed in China before the British arrived, but as a minor practice. The company's introduction of industrially produced Indian opium changed this. The volume available increased dramatically. The price fell. Consumption spread from the elite to the broader population. By the early 19th century, significant portions of Chinese society, including significant portions of the Chinese civil service, military, and aristocracy, were addicted. The Chinese government, understandably alarmed, attempted to prohibit the trade. The company, which derived enormous revenues from the opium sales, found this inconvenient. And the British government, whose East India Company revenues funded a significant portion of British Indian administration, found it equally inconvenient. This is the context for the Opium Wars. Two conflicts, 1939–1942 and 1856–1860, in which Britain went to war, in part, to maintain its right to sell opium to a country whose government had attempted to prevent the sale. Britain won both wars. China was forced to legalize the opium trade and open its ports further to British commerce. This is sometimes described, in the neutral language of history, as the opening of China to trade. What it opened was a pipe. The same substance being prescribed to English invalids and dropped into English infants was being used, in quantities of hundreds of thousands of chests per year, to create mass addiction in China in service of British imperial economics. The moral coherence of this system was not invisible to contemporaries. Debates in Parliament about the opium trade were sometimes pointed, and at least a few MPs used the word iniquitous. But they lost the votes. The profits were too large. What the opium trade built, in practical terms, was this. The revenues from selling opium to China financed British India. British India was the jewel of the empire. The jewel of the empire was paid for, in significant part, by two forms of opium dependency. The refined medicinal laudanum, consumed by the English middle classes, and the smoking opium, consumed by the Chinese working classes. They were the same plant, processed differently, distributed differently, affecting different bodies in different countries. They were the same machine, the Opium Wars. When Britain became a drug cartel. In March 1839, a Chinese imperial commissioner named Lin Zexu arrived in Canton and seized approximately 20,000 chests of opium from British merchants. Each chest contained between 130 and 160 pounds of prepared opium. Lin Zexu had the entire stock mixed with salt and lime and sluiced into the sea. Then he wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. The letter is one of the extraordinary documents of the 19th century. Lin Zexu addressed Victoria directly and personally, appealing to her as a monarch and as a human being. He noted that Britain prohibited the sale of opium at home. This was largely true. Domestic opium sale was much more controlled than the export trade, while profiting from its sale to China. He pointed out that this was a moral inconsistency so obvious that a child might see it. He asked her, on the grounds of basic justice, to prohibit the opium trade. Victoria didn't reply. It's not clear she ever saw the letter. The response Britain gave was not a letter, it was warships. The First Opium War, 1839–1847, ended with the Treaty of Nanking, in which China ceded Hong Kong to Britain, opened 5 treaty ports to British trade, paid a large indemnity, and agreed to normalize relations which in practice meant accepting the continuing presence of opium in its economy. The opium trade was not explicitly legalized in this treaty. It didn't need to be. The military defeat had made Chinese resistance to it impossible. The Second Opium War, 1856–1860, triggered by a dispute over a ship's flag and used as a pretext to renegotiate the treaty terms, ended with China formally legalizing the opium trade, opening further ports, and paying further indemnities. The historical judgment on these wars has sharpened as the decades have passed. What began as a narrative of British commercial interests and the opening of China has been recognized more clearly with each generation of scholarship as state-sponsored drug dealing backed by military force. The Chinese word for the Opium Wars, Ya Pianzhongzheng, translates simply as the Opium Wars, no euphemism. In Britain, for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, they were taught under the anodyne heading of the opening of China to trade. The trade in question was opium. The opening was achieved by cannon. This context matters for understanding laudanum in Georgian and Victorian England because it reveals what laudanum was. Not a domestic medicine created to help the English cope with toothache, but one product of an industrialized, militarized, globally organized opium industry that generated revenues of a scale that the British state had no interest in examining too closely. The penny bottle at the chemist shop was downstream of a river of money and violence that stretched to the Pearl River Delta. The opium dens of Limehouse. Fear, exoticism, and class walk east from the city of London, through Whitechapel, into Stepney, into the district that had been called Limehouse since the medieval lime kilns that once operated there. By the second half of the 19th century, Limehouse was one of the centres of London's Chinese community sailors who had arrived on East India Company and merchant navy ships, small businessmen, men who had settled near the docks where their ships berthed. And in Limehouse you could smoke opium. The opium dens of Limehouse were real places. Not precisely the lurid venues of Victorian fiction and journalism, not the elaborate underground palaces of corruption that Charles Dickens described in The Mystery of Edwin Drood, not quite the grotesque theatrical dens of Conan Doyle's home stories, but real establishments, rooms where opium smokers gathered, where the equipment was provided, where a man could smoke and sleep and return to relative sobriety over the course of an evening or a day. The majority of the clientele were Chinese sailors, men who had been smoking opium in their home country and continued to do so in London as a matter of course, of cultural habit, of comfort in a foreign city. The idea that Limehouse's opium dens were primarily engines of white English corruption was largely a fiction of the journalism and fiction of the period. Middle-class and working-class English opium users had their laudanum bottles and their chemists. The dens were a Chinese social institution adapted to an English port city, but the fiction served a purpose. The opium den narrative located addiction, the visible, dramatic, socially frightening face of addiction in the Chinese community, in the foreign and the exotic. It made addiction an import, a contamination, something that arrived with the wrong sort of sailor from the wrong sort of country. This had two effects, both useful to the people generating the narrative. First, it made addiction visible as a social problem rather than invisible as a medical condition, but it placed it safely outside respectable English society. The laudanum addict in the middle-class drawing room was an invalid. The opium smoker in Limehouse was a symptom of a foreign vice. The chemistry was identical. The social interpretation was entirely different. Second, it provided a narrative for drug control legislation that focused on opium smoking, the Chinese practice, while leaving laudanum sales largely intact for considerably longer. The first significant legal restrictions on opium in Britain targeted opium dens specifically, before restricting the pharmaceutical trade. The Chinese community bore the legislative burden of a problem that the English middle class was equally participating in. Behind closed doors, with brown bottles purchased legally at the chemist, Dickens set his opium den scene at the opening of Edwin Drood, with a woman described as degraded, ruined, barely human, a figure of horror. Dickens also knew, by the time he wrote those scenes, that his closest friends had laudanum bottles beside their beds. The line between the horror of the den and the respectability of the bedroom was not pharmacological. It was entirely social. The patent medicine industry. Bottled lies. By the middle of the 19th century, laudanum had spawned an entire industry of proprietary medicines, preparations whose exact compositions were trade secrets, marketed under brand names, sold through chemists and by mail, advertised in newspapers with claims that would today result in criminal prosecution. The patent medicine industry was, in essence, an opium industry with better branding. Winslow's soothing syrup contained morphine and alcohol. Ayer's cherry pectoral contained an opium compound. Dover's powder contained both opium and ipecac. Chlorodyne, massively popular, sold by multiple manufacturers, contained morphine, cannabis, and chloroform. Collis Brown's mixture, still available today in reduced form without the opiates, was originally an opium and chloroform compound. These preparations were not required by law to list their ingredients. Used too. Most did not, because the commercial appeal of a secret formula was stronger than any transparency concern, and because there was no legal requirement compelling disclosure. A customer who bought a proprietary medicine was buying a name and a promise, not a formulation. The promises were extraordinary. Patent medicines were advertised for conditions ranging from female complaints, a catch-all covering everything from menstrual pain to postnatal depression to consumption, cancer, nervous debility, rheumatism, cholera, smallpox, and the general condition the Victorians called dyspepsia, and we might call being alive and uncomfortable. The advertisements implied, and sometimes directly stated, cures that the medicines could not provide for any condition except pain, and for pain they were, temporarily, genuinely effective. The income from patent medicines was enormous. By the late 19th century, the patent medicine industry was worth hundreds of millions of pounds annually. It advertised in newspapers, which meant the newspapers had strong financial incentives not to investigate or criticize the products they advertised. It sent medicines through the post to rural communities that had no access to physicians and sometimes no chemist, reaching populations that had no other source of information about the preparations they were taking. A woman in rural Devon or rural Wales who ordered Mrs. Nissis Winslow's soothing syrup by post was taking morphine prescribed to her by a newspaper advertisement. She had no way of knowing this. The bottle said soothing. The testimonials in the newspaper said miraculous. The baby stopped crying. She ordered another bottle. Mrs. Bissam, Winslow's soothing syrup and the industry that killed children. The name was invented. There was no Mrs. Winslow. The brand was created by a partnership between an American patent medicine manufacturer and a British distributor, and it named its product after a fictional grandmother figure. Warm, experienced, trustworthy, the sort of woman who would know what to do about a crying baby. Mrs. Price. Winslow's soothing syrup contained, in its original formulation, approximately 65 milligrams of morphine per fluid ounce. A standard dose for a young infant was 1 teaspoon, approximately 5 milliliters, containing roughly 11 milligrams of morphine. A potentially fatal dose of morphine for an infant of 6 months weighing 7 kilograms is in the range of 2 to 4 milligrams. The medicine was dosed, in other words, at roughly 3 to 5 times a potentially fatal level for the infants it was primarily marketed for. It was sold in Britain and America from approximately 1845 until 1930, 95 years. In that time, the formula was adjusted several times, generally reducing the morphine content in response to increasing regulatory pressure. But the core proposition, give this to your baby and it will stop hurting, remained constant, and the core ingredient, an opioid, remained present until regulation finally forced its removal. The marketing was brilliant and comprehensive. The product was endorsed by physicians, though the endorsements were often purchased. It was advertised with testimonials from grateful mothers. It was sold with the implicit authority of the word soothing, a word that implied gentleness, care, naturalness. Nobody knows exactly how many infants died from Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, because the deaths were never systematically recorded as such. Infant mortality in the Victorian period was high from multiple causes: infection, malnutrition, exposure, and an infant who died after a dose of soothing syrup could easily be recorded as dying from any of these other causes. The crib death that followed a double dose was overlaying. The convulsions that followed a full bottle were fits. The cold, still baby was evidence of the difficulty of raising children in poverty, not evidence of what was in the bottle on the shelf. The American Medical Association finally published an analysis of the syrup's composition in 1911, listing its morphine content explicitly and calling it a preparation likely to kill the infant or cause it grave injury. By this point, the syrup had been on sale for 66 years. The laudanum suicide. A Victorian fashion. There is something particular about the way laudanum appeared in Victorian suicide that has no modern parallel. Laudanum was, by the middle of the 19th century, associated with a specific kind of death, a female death, largely. A death that was quiet and aesthetic and suggested neither violence nor transgression, but something more like surrender. A woman lying on her bed, pale, cold, a laudanum bottle beside her. This was how certain women died in Victorian literature, and it was how some women chose to die in Victorian life. The appeal, such as it was, had several components. Laudanum was available, no planning or procurement required. It was already in the medicine cabinet. It was familiar, you already knew what it did to you, because you'd been taking it for years. It was quiet. The death it produced was not violent, not disfiguring, not the kind of death that left the body in a condition difficult for the people who found it. And it was, given the societal understanding of the time, ambiguous. A woman found dead with an empty laudanum bottle had almost certainly overdosed deliberately, but the verdict, accidental, was available, and it protected the family from the legal and religious consequences of suicide. This ambiguity was itself part of the appeal. A woman who wanted to die, but who also wanted to spare her family the shame of suicide could, with laudanum, achieve both. The choice was final. The verdict was open. Rossetti's decision to burn Elizabeth Sadow's note was rational in this context. It turned a probable suicide into an unquestionable accident. Coroners in the 19th century returned verdicts of accidental laudanum death at rates that most modern researchers consider inconsistent with the actual probability of accidental overdose in people known to take the drug medicinally. The social preference for the accidental verdict was strong enough to override the forensic evidence in many cases. Death by laudanum was, depending on the social position and reputation of the deceased, regularly reclassified from chosen to accidental. What this means is that the statistics on laudanum suicide are unreliable, which makes it impossible to know the true scale. We can say that laudanum appeared disproportionately often in coroners' reports for women under 40. We can say that the correlation between laudanum availability and female suicide rates was noticed and commented upon by Victorian physicians. We can say that the connection between the respectable female addiction and suicide was documented in medical literature by writers who attributed it to the dangerousness of the drug being prescribed too freely. What they didn't say, though, the evidence supported it, was that they were also describing the consequences of lives so constrained and so painful that the drug initially prescribed to make those lives bearable had become, for some women, the tool of escape from them. The cures that killed you. Victorian addiction treatment. The Victorian physician faced with a laudanum addict had a problem. He didn't know what he was dealing with. Not because he was unintelligent or uninformed, because the conceptual framework that would allow him to understand opioid addiction as a physiological condition with physical dependency, withdrawal syndrome, neurological adaptation simply didn't exist yet. What he had was observation. Some people couldn't stop taking laudanum even when they wanted to. And moral philosophy. The soul must overcome the body's demands. And a variety of treatments developed in the same empirical spirit that had produced laudanum itself. Try things and see what happens. The most common treatment recommended was abrupt cessation, cold turkey, though that phrase wasn't yet in use. The physician would instruct the patient to stop taking laudanum and to persevere through the subsequent suffering by force of will. This approach was applied with the best of intentions and reliably produced the worst outcomes. Acute withdrawal syndrome, sometimes severe enough to cause seizures and cardiac events, followed by the intense anhedonia of post-acute withdrawal, followed almost invariably by relapse. Abrupt opioid withdrawal can be fatal, a fact that Victorian physicians were vaguely aware of but whose mechanism they couldn't explain. Alternatively, physicians tried gradual reduction, tapering the dose over weeks or months. This was closer to what modern medicine would recommend, but it was rarely done carefully enough, rarely accompanied by the psychological support that might have helped the patient endure the process, and rarely successful. Patients tapered, then relapsed, then tapered again. Some physicians tried substitution. Alcohol was sometimes prescribed as an alternative to laudanum, on the theory that it addressed similar symptoms with less severe dependency. This produced alcohol addiction in people who were simultaneously recovering from opioid dependency, an outcome that the theory hadn't anticipated because the theory hadn't included the concept of addiction. Cannabis preparations were tried. Chloroform was tried, producing chloroform dependency in several cases. Bromide salts were tried for the nervous symptoms. The most alarming treatment, in retrospect, was hypodermic morphine injection. In the 1860s and 1870s, the hypodermic syringe became widely available, and physicians began treating laudanum dependency by injecting morphine directly into the vein, on the theory that injected morphine would produce faster and more complete satiation, allowing smaller doses to achieve the same effect. What it produced was injectable morphine addiction in people whose oral opioid habits had already reorganized their nervous systems. And in the 1890s, Bayer Pharmaceutical released a new product. They synthesized a derivative of morphine that they believed was non-addictive. They called it heroin, from the German heroisch, meaning heroic. They initially marketed it as a cure for morphine addiction and laudanum dependency. The irony is so complete that it circles back to horror, the temperance movement's blind spot. In the 1830s and 1840s, a powerful social movement swept through Britain and America, targeting what it identified as the primary cause of poverty, crime, domestic violence, and moral degradation among the working class. The target was gin, and beer, and wine, alcohol, in all its forms, as a substance so destructive to human life and society that its restriction or elimination was a moral imperative. The temperance movement, and later the total abstinence movement, was not wrong about alcohol's destructive effects in the communities it documented. The gin shops of London, the alehouse culture of industrial cities, the drinking patterns of men who spent their weekly wages before their families saw them. These were real and genuinely terrible phenomena. Alcoholism destroyed families, shortened lives, produced violence and poverty in ways that were visible, documented, and devastating. But the temperance movement, in its energetic focus on alcohol, did not apply the same scrutiny to laudanum. This was not simple hypocrisy, though it had a hypocritical dimension. The distinction that temperance advocates drew between alcohol and laudanum was, in part, a class distinction. Alcohol in excess was visible in the streets. It produced the staggering drunkard, the abusive husband, the neglected child, the family evicted for unpaid rent. These were primarily, though not exclusively, working-class phenomena, and they were publicly visible. Laudanum addiction was primarily, though not exclusively, middle-class and female, and it was private. The invalid lady on her sofa was not a temperance target. Her laudanum was her physician's prescription, the product of a respectable industry, used in the respectable privacy of her home. The working-class woman who doped her baby with Godfrey's Cordial was more visible, but she was doing something that had medical sanction, not consuming a demonized recreational substance. Some temperance advocates did identify the contradiction. The American temperance writer Francis Willard, the English physician Norman Kerr, and others wrote explicitly about laudanum's role in the addiction landscape and called for consistent treatment of all addictive substances. But these voices were marginal within a movement that had targeted alcohol specifically, and whose political and social energy was organized around that target. The result was a decades-long situation in which alcohol faced increasing legislative pressure, eventually leading to prohibition in America and strict licensing laws in Britain, while laudanum and its patent medicine derivatives remained available with minimal restriction. An English working-class man who wanted to drink gin faced increasing moral condemnation and eventually legal obstruction. His wife, taking laudanum prescribed by her physician, faced none of either. The different treatment was not based on pharmacology. It was based on class, gender, and the accident of which substance had been adopted by which social groups for which visible purposes. The chemistry didn't produce these distinctions. Osti did, Georgian medicine, when everything was laudanum. To understand why laudanum was so ubiquitous, you need to understand what Victorian and Georgian physicians were working with. Before germ theory, which didn't become established until the 1860s and 1870s, and didn't transform medical practice immediately, even then, most diseases had no explanation and no treatment. Physicians could observe symptoms with considerable precision. They could not, in most cases, do anything about the underlying cause, because they didn't know what the underlying cause was. Cholera killed hundreds of thousands of Londoners in three major epidemics, 1832, 1849, 1854, before John Snow identified contaminated water as the transmission vector in 1854. And even then, the medical establishment largely rejected his conclusions for years because they didn't fit existing theories. Tuberculosis, which killed roughly 1 in 5 of all adults in Britain during the first half of the 19th century, was attributed variously to heredity, constitutional weakness, damp air, poverty, and moral deficiency, not to the Mycobacterium tuberculosis that Robert Koch identified in 1882. In the face of diseases whose mechanisms were unknown, the physician's options were limited, and his remedies were largely theatrical. He could bleed his patient a practice based on humoral theory that was genuinely harmful, but persisted well into the 19th century. He could purge them, administer laxatives or emetics that produced dramatic effects without treating any underlying condition. He could prescribe preparations of mercury, arsenic, antimony, heavy metals that produced visible physiological effects and therefore seemed active, while generally causing additional harm. Or he could give laudanum. Laudanum, unlike the bleeding and the heavy metals, actually produced a therapeutic effect. It reduced pain. It suppressed coughs. It calmed the anxious and the grieving. It allowed people with chronic conditions to sleep. In a world where the physician's other tools were bleeding, purging, and poisoning, laudanum was the best available intervention for an enormous range of complaints. The indications for which laudanum was prescribed in the Georgian and Victorian period were so broad as to encompass almost all of human suffering. For acute pain, laudanum. For chronic pain, laudanum. For coughs, including the consumption cough that was killing 1/5 of the population, laudanum. For anxiety, laudanum. For insomnia, laudanum. For diarrhoea, including cholera, where it suppressed symptoms without touching the infection, laudanum. For menstrual pain, laudanum. For postnatal depression, laudanum. For the pain of cancer, laudanum. For the pain of dying of almost anything, laudanum. For the crying baby, laudanum. There was a circular logic to this prescribing that physicians of the time couldn't fully see, because to see it you needed the concept of addiction, which they didn't have. Laudanum was prescribed for anxiety. The anxiety resolved for a few hours. Then it returned, slightly intensified, as the brain's stress systems, briefly suppressed, rebounded. More laudanum was prescribed for the intensified anxiety. The dose increased. The anxiety, between doses, intensified further. The prescription followed. This escalation was interpreted as the worsening of the original anxiety disorder, not as the pharmacological consequences of treating anxiety with opiates. The physician who watched this happen was not negligent. He was applying the best knowledge available, but the knowledge was missing, the crucial piece, that the medicine was creating a condition that made more medicine necessary indefinitely until the dose became incompatible with life, children, and laudanum. The statistics. Nobody counted. The mortality statistics of Victorian England are extensive. Victorian England was obsessed with mortality statistics. It counted and classified and categorized the dead with a thoroughness that reflected both administrative competence and a genuine awareness that people were dying in alarming numbers and that this was, at least in principle, preventable. What the statistics don't show is how many children died of laudanum, not because the deaths didn't happen, because the recording system wasn't looking for them. A child who died after a dose of Godfrey's Cordial could be recorded as dying of convulsions, a catch-all for any death accompanied by the seizure-like muscle contractions that opioid overdose produces in some children, or of debility, a broad category covering any death in which the child had simply seemed too weak to survive, or of unknown causes, the coroner's shrug when nothing specific could be identified, or, as mentioned, of overlay, the accidental smothering that was statistically implausible at the rates at which it was recorded, but which provided a decorous explanation for deaths in cribs. The physicians who were aware of the problem did occasionally put numbers to it. Dr. John Whitaker's 1868 Nottingham estimate, hundreds of infant deaths per year in that city alone from Godfrey's Cordial, is one of the more specific ones. A physician named Charles Rimington estimated in the 1880s that Godfrey's Cordial was responsible for somewhere between a quarter and a third of all infant deaths in the manufacturing districts he worked in. These estimates were published in medical journals that the public didn't read and that policymakers read without apparent urgency. The difficulty, then and now, was the counterfactual. If you can't specify the cause of death with certainty, you can't demonstrate the connection to the medicine. A child who died after a dose of Godfrey's Cordial might have died anyway from the illness that prompted the dose. This uncertainty, genuine, not manufactured, allowed the manufacturers and their advocates to contest every specific case and every general estimate. This structure of deniability is recognizable. It is exactly the structure that the tobacco industry used in the 20th century to resist the connection between smoking and lung cancer. It is the structure that the opioid pharmaceutical industry used in the 21st century to resist the connection between OxyContin and opioid addiction and death. The pattern is old. The effective period of denial is always decades long. The people who die during those decades are real. The children who died of Godfrey's Cordial were real. They were mostly the children of poor women in manufacturing cities who were trying to manage an impossible combination of industrial labor demands and childcare. They died quietly, in cribs, in rooms that were cold and dark. They were buried in the overcrowded municipal cemeteries of cities that were producing wealth on a scale the world had never seen and distributing it in ways that left most of its producers with nothing to spare. Their names are in the burial record. Their cause of death is convulsions, or debility, or unknown. The Godfrey's Cordial bottle is not mentioned. It didn't survive to be evidence. The language of addiction, before the word existed. The word addiction, in its modern sense denoting a compulsive neurobiological dependency characterized by tolerance, withdrawal, craving, and loss of control, entered the English language in roughly its current form in the early 20th century. Before that, the language available for describing what was happening to the laudanum user was limited, approximate, and largely moral. Habit was the most common term. A person had the laudanum habit, a somewhat neutral word that described the pattern of use without theorizing about its causes. Habit implied something voluntary in its origin, even if difficult to break. You would form the habit, as you might form a habit of waking early or of reading before bed. The implication was a habit could be unformed by application of will. Slave appeared frequently, usually in the melodramatic register of temperance literature, but also in personal accounts. De Quincey described himself as a slave to opium at multiple points in his writings, a word that acknowledged the loss of control, but framed it metaphorically rather than mechanistically. He was enslaved to a substance rather than having a neurological condition. The language of slavery made the experience legible through an existing moral and social category, rather than requiring a new medical one. Victim appeared less often, but significantly, particularly in accounts of women who had been given laudanum by physicians. A woman who was a victim of the laudanum habit had been victimized by the drug, or the prescriber, or the circumstances of her life. This framing removed some moral responsibility from the individual and placed it elsewhere, but without developing a physiological account of why the drug produced its effects. What was missing was a word for the mechanism, for the fact that repeated exposure to opioids physically changes the opioid receptors in the brain, down-regulating their sensitivity and reducing the production of endogenous opioids, so that the addicted person is not choosing the drug, but is experiencing a genuine physiological need for it, without which their brain cannot regulate mood, pain, or basic function. Without this word, without the concept, the experience of addiction was always being described through analogies that didn't quite fit. It was like enslavement, but the enslaver was invisible. It was like habit, but habits could be broken by people with far less apparent will than the laudanum addict might possess in other areas of their life. It was like illness. But illnesses were supposed to be things that happened to you, not things you had initially chosen. De Quincey came closest of all his contemporaries to articulating the mechanism, not in medical language, but in literary language, in the description of the pains and pleasures, the escalating doses, the physical effects of withdrawal, the way the drug reorganized his inner life around itself. If you read the Confessions with modern pharmacological knowledge, you recognize what he's describing. The people who read it in 1821 recognized a fascinating and tragic personal narrative, but they didn't have the framework to extract the general principle. The framework came slowly. Benjamin Ball, writing in France in the 1880s, developed the concept of morphinism as a medical condition with physiological underpinnings. Norman Kerr in England wrote extensively about the disease of inebriety and argued that it was a medical rather than moral matter. These voices accumulated. They were minority voices for a long time. The moral framework, the weakness of will, the bad choice made repeatedly was more intuitively satisfying to a society built around the idea that individuals controlled their own destinies. But the mechanism doesn't care about the framework. The opioid receptors were down-regulating in Georgian brains exactly as they down-regulate in contemporary ones. The withdrawal syndrome De Quincey described in 1821 was physiologically identical to the withdrawal syndrome described in emergency rooms in 2024. The molecule hasn't changed, only the language has. The working-class addict versus Forters. The aesthetic addict. There were two dominant cultural images of laudanum addiction in the 19th century, and they were entirely different people. The first was Thomas De Quincey, intellectual, sensitive, melancholy, a man of extraordinary inner life who had turned his addiction into literature. Reading him, you encountered a consciousness struggling with something sublime, the dark pleasures of opium, the architectural nightmares of withdrawal, the philosophical questions about selfhood and will and time that his experience had generated. His addiction was a wound, yes, but it was also a source. It had made him who he was. The second was the woman in the factory district giving Godfrey's Cordial to her baby, or taking a dose herself before her shift to get through the 12-hour day in the cotton mill, or lying in a court dwelling too ill from chronic opium use to work and being recorded in the census as no occupation. These two figures were consuming pharmacologically identical substances. The organic chemistry of morphine binding to opioid receptors doesn't change based on the literary output of the consumer. What changed was everything surrounding the chemistry. Income, education, social position, the narrative available to describe the experience, and the consequences of visibility. De Quincey's addiction was visible in print, which made it illustrious. He published it, oiled it, he performed it, in the sense that he shaped his narrative with considerable literary art, emphasizing the philosophical dimensions and the extraordinary quality of the inner experience. He was not hiding what he was. He was making it magnificent. The working-class addicted woman had no literary apparatus. Her experience was not published. It was recorded, if at all, in coroner's reports, in the notes of social investigators, in the occasional medical journal article that described the laudanum habit among the manufacturing classes. Her inner experience, the same neurological events, the same craving, the same withdrawal, the same dreams was not considered material for art. It was a problem to be solved or ignored. The consequences of this division were practical and lasting. De Quincey's class position meant that his addiction was managed imperfectly, but managed within a network of social and professional relationships that could absorb it. When he was too debilitated to write, his editors waited. When he needed money, his friends provided it. When his behavior became strange, his eccentricities were attributed to genius rather than to disease. He was never imprisoned for his habit, never institutionalized, never lost the social standing that allowed him to continue to function at some level. The working-class woman had no such network. Her addiction, if it became visible, meant loss of employment, potential loss of children if the authorities became involved, poverty compounded by the expense of the drug, and the additional shame of having failed at the domestic and maternal roles that her social position required of her. She had no literary tradition of the romantic addict to shelter her. She had the temperance pamphlet's vision of the fallen woman. Same drug, same molecule, entirely different world. De Quincey's dreams, the nightmares that lasted years. The most frightening passages in Confessions of an English Opium Eater are not about withdrawal, they're about the dreams. In the early years of his opium use, De Quincey's dreams were, by his account, magnificent. The drug expanded his visual imagination, created architectures in sleep that he found genuinely beautiful, produced a kind of involuntary aesthetic experience of extraordinary richness. He was an insomniac by nature, and the sleep that laudanum gave him was, in those early years, a gift, deep, populated with meaningful imagery, a compensation for the difficulty of his waking hours. Then, as his use intensified and his physiology adapted, the dreams changed. What emerged from his chronic high-dose opium use was something he called the machinery of dreaming, an involuntary system of image production that was no longer beautiful or pleasurable, but vast, repetitive, and suffused with dread. The architecture that had once been magnificent became threatening, not through any single frightening element, but through scale. Spaces became too large, crowds became too dense, faces multiplied to numbers that pressed against the edges of what consciousness could contain. He began to revisit scenes from his childhood in these dreams, specifically from the period when his older sister Elizabeth had died, when he was 5 years old. The grief of that loss, which he had carried for decades, was reconstructed in opium dreams with a freshness and immediacy that felt, he wrote, more like re-experiencing than remembering. He stood again at his sister's bedside. He walked again through the rooms of his childhood home. He was 5 years old, and she was dying, and everything that would follow the years of laudanum, the celebrity, the suffering had not yet happened. And all that was real was this particular room and this particular loss. These dreams are, in modern terms, a recognizable consequence of opioid use. Chronic high-dose opioid use disrupts REM sleep architecture. During periods of relative withdrawal, the nights when the dose was lower, when the body was pushing back against the drug suppression of dreaming, REM rebound occurs, and with it the intense, emotionally charged dreams that are the nervous system's processing of suppressed experience. The traumatic content of De Quincey's dreams, the dead sister, the grief of a 5-year-old, the architectural spaces of fear, was the psychological material that his conscious mind had sealed off, and that the drug and its withdrawal were opening, involuntarily, every night. He could not close the door. He had no therapy, no framework, no way to approach this material consciously and work through it. It came to him in sleep, in terrifying visual fragments, and it came back the next night, and the next. The only relief was more laudanum. More opium pressed the dreams back down, suppressed the REM, quieted the machinery, until the next night, when the same cycle began again. This is what the pains of opium meant, in concrete terms. Not withdrawal cramps, though those are real. The dreams that arrived every time the dose was even slightly reduced. The dreams that De Quincey could not escape without the drug that was producing them. The doctor, who prescribed it to himself. John Brown was a Scottish physician, founder of what became known as the Brownian system of medicine, a theory that organized all disease as either sthenic, involving excessive stimulation, or asthenic, involving insufficient stimulation, with the treatment being to either reduce stimulation or increase it. To increase stimulation in debilitated patients, Brown prescribed alcohol and opium. To himself, he prescribed opium, which he took for a condition he described as debility, a vague Victorian medical term that covered a multitude of symptoms from chronic fatigue to anxiety to what we might now recognize as depression. By the end of his career, Brown was taking prodigious quantities of laudanum quantities that his students observed with a mixture of awe and concern, and that his critics cited as evidence that his system was as much a theory of self-medication as a genuine medical framework. Brown is not the most famous physician addict of the 19th century, but he is representative of a pattern that appears with striking frequency in the period. The physician who prescribed laudanum constantly, who understood its mechanisms as well as anyone of the time could, who saw its effects daily in his patients, who nonetheless took it himself, in quantities that exceeded his own prescribing recommendations. The pattern makes perfect sense from the inside. Physicians were exposed to extreme human suffering constantly, with inadequate tools to address it. They worked long hours in difficult conditions, often in the most diseased and desperate quarters of Victorian cities. They had chronic pain themselves, or anxiety, or the kind of emotional fatigue that comes from seeing too much death without any protective distance. And they had, readily available in their own dispensary, the most effective available remedy for all of these conditions. The physician addict is sometimes presented as a failure of professional ethics, a doctor who should have known better. But the doctors who became addicted to their own prescriptions weren't ignorant of laudanum's dangers. They were simply in the same position as every other patient, knowing that something was bad for them in the long term, but feeling every day that the short term was too immediate and too painful to endure without it. What you prescribe to others and what you take yourself is sometimes the same thing. The physician's professional knowledge doesn't immunize him against the pharmacological reality. The same receptors, the same tolerance, the same withdrawal. When it became illegal, the slow closing of the bottle. The history of how laudanum went from universally available medicine to controlled substance is not a story of sudden enlightenment. It is a story of incremental pressure, legislative compromise, and the slow, grudging acknowledgement that what had been sold as medicine was creating illness on a population scale. The first significant legal step in Britain was the Pharmacy Act of 1868, which required that sales of laudanum and other opium preparations be made only by registered pharmacists and that the sale be recorded in a poison register. This regulation was modest. It didn't require a prescription, it didn't restrict quantities, and it didn't prevent the sale of patent medicines with opiate content. But it acknowledged for the first time in statute that these substances warranted some degree of oversight. In America, the progression was faster and more dramatic. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 imposed strict federal controls on the production, importation, distribution, and sale of opiates and cocaine. Under this act, opiates could only be dispensed by registered physicians and only for legitimate medical purposes. The act was interpreted increasingly strictly through the 1910s and 1920s, to the point where maintaining an addict on a stable dose of opiates prescribing to manage dependency rather than to cure it was held by some courts to be outside the act's legitimate medical purpose. Provision. This interpretation had a brutal consequence. It criminalized addiction itself, in the sense that the addict could no longer obtain the drug legally, was driven to the black market or to criminal activity to fund their habit, and faced prosecution for possession rather than treatment for a medical condition. In Britain, the response to the same problem was different. The Ralston Committee, reporting in 1926, recommended that physicians be allowed to prescribe opiates to addicts in maintenance doses, recognizing that dependency was a medical condition requiring management, not a moral failing requiring punishment. The British system of treating addiction through medical maintenance rather than criminal prosecution produced dramatically different outcomes from the American approach through the middle decades of the 20th century. These different legal frameworks in Britain and America, both responses to the same problem of mass opiate addiction that the laudanum era had created, produced societies with very different relationships to opioid drugs for the rest of the 20th century, and both, in different ways, set the terms for the opioid crisis of the 21st century, one by normalizing the criminalization of addiction, one by normalizing the medicalization of opioid use. The laudanum bottle was closed. The problem it had uncapped was not. The legacy. Every modern opioid crisis started here. In 2017, the United States recorded over 70,000 deaths from opioid overdose in a single year, a number larger than all American military deaths in the Vietnam War. This was described as unprecedented, a new crisis, an emergency requiring immediate response. It was neither new nor unprecedented. It was the third iteration at least of a mass opioid crisis to occur in the English-speaking world since the Industrial Revolution. The first was the laudanum era, the period from roughly 1750 to 1900, during which opium preparations were sold freely, prescribed without restraint, incorporated into patent medicines, and distributed to populations that had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. The deaths of infants in Godfrey's Cordial cribs, of middle-class women in laudanum and suicide bedrooms, of working-class men and women consuming themselves through patent medicines were not counted systematically and were not attributed as a category to the drug. They were scattered across the records as convulsions, debility, unknown causes. The second was the heroin crisis that followed the closure of the laudanum era, a crisis that the Harrison Act response created, in part, by criminalizing the addict. The heroin distributed through the black market that replaced the chemist's shop was of variable purity, injected with non-sterile equipment, purchased through criminal networks, and consumed in conditions that maximized overdose risk. It killed differently than laudanum had, but it was the same pharmacology, the same human needs, the same structural failure to address addiction as a health problem. The third, the OxyContin crisis of the 1990s and 2000s, is the most recent and most elaborately documented. Purdue Pharma released OxyContin in 1996 with the explicit claim that its sustained-release formulation made it less addictive than immediate-release opioids. This claim was false. The company knew it was false. They marketed it aggressively to physicians, particularly in rural communities with limited healthcare access and high rates of chronic pain from physical labor. The result was a tsunami of opioid addiction in communities that had not experienced anything like this since the laudanum era, followed by an epidemic of heroin use when OxyContin became too expensive or too difficult to obtain, and then an epidemic of fentanyl deaths when heroin was adulterated with the synthetic opioid 60 to 100 times more potent than morphine. Each of these crises has the same structure. A pharmaceutical or commercial actor identifies a market people in pain and supplies them with a product that is genuinely effective for pain in the short term. The product's addictive properties are minimized, denied, or simply not investigated. The users develop dependency without understanding what is happening to them. The dependency becomes visible as a social problem. The response is either criminalization or inadequate treatment. The death toll accumulates. The laudanum crisis of the 19th century didn't look like a crisis because the deaths were invisible, because the framework for understanding them as a category didn't exist, because the substance was medicine. The opioid crisis of the 21st century looked like a crisis because the framework now existed, because the deaths were counted, because the legal and journalistic apparatus of a modern state could process the event as an event rather than as background mortality. But the factory worker taking laudanum before her shift in Birmingham in 1850, and the construction worker taking OxyContin for his back injury in West Virginia in 2005 were in more similar situations than the century and a half between them suggests. Both were in real pain. Both were given a pharmacological solution to that pain by a commercial and medical system that did not fully disclose the consequences. Both became dependent. Both found that the solutions available to them for their dependency, whether moral exhortation in the Victorian church or a criminal record in the American court, addressed the surface without touching the pharmacology. The molecule is ancient. The crisis is perpetual. The only thing that changes is what we call it. De Quincey at 74. 55 years of addiction. In 1859, Thomas de Quincey was 73 years old. He had first taken laudanum in 1804 when he was 19. He had been addicted, in varying degrees and with varying attempts at reduction, for 55 years. He was still writing. He had published essays, criticism, autobiographical pieces throughout the 1840s and 1850s, collecting them in the multi-volume works that appeared in the last decade of his life. The writing was uneven. Sometimes the luminous intelligence of his early prose shone through. Sometimes the sentences wandered and the argument dissolved. But he was still producing, still thinking, still moving his pen across paper in a study in Edinburgh that was famously chaotic, filled with books and manuscripts and the detritus of a life that had never quite submitted to domestic order. He had tried to stop the laudanum or to reduce it significantly many times. He had described these attempts in essays that updated his readers on the continuing struggle. He had achieved periods of reduced use, he reported in 1845, with evident satisfaction that he had reduced his dose to a fraction of its former level, a reduction that he described as near miraculous, a triumph of will over the most implacable opponent he had ever faced. But he had not stopped, and in his final years, the dose crept up again, as it always had, as it always did, as the pharmacology required. What De Quincey's long life shows, in one way of reading it, is the relative stability that high-dose opioid maintenance could produce in the right circumstances. He had a roof over his head, supporters who helped him when he was too incapacitated to work, a reputation that created ongoing demand for his writing and access to consistent laudanum. He didn't have to steal. He didn't have to buy from criminal networks. He didn't risk exposure to adulterants. He managed, after a fashion, for 55 years. He died in 1859 at 74. The obituaries praised his extraordinary prose, his scholarship, his philosophical range, his influence on the next generation of romantic writers. They mentioned the opium it was impossible to ignore, given that he had made it the subject of his most celebrated work. but they treated it as a curiosity of character, a wound he had borne, a part of the great strange composite person that Thomas de Quincey had been. The laudanum was mentioned the way you mention a difficult childhood or a bad marriage in an obituary context, not cause. The cause of death listed was debility. He had written 38 years earlier in the Confessions that opium had both given and taken, that it had given him pleasures he could not have found elsewhere, and taken from him a capacity for productive work and ordinary happiness that he mourned for decades. He was, probably, correct about both parts of this. The pleasures were real. The pleasures were gone. What remained at the end was the dependency, neither pleasurable nor terrible, just necessary, just the water level his body required to function, just the baseline from which every day was measured. 55 years. And the world, looking on, still had no better word for it than habit. The brown bottle is empty now. The chemist's shop is a heritage building. You need a prescription, and then a child-proof cap, and then a pharmacist consultation before you can take anything stronger than ibuprofen. None of this happened because the molecule changed. Morphine today is chemically identical to the morphine in De Quincey's laudanum bottle in 1804. The opioid receptors in the human brainstem are identical. The mechanism of dependency is identical. The withdrawal syndrome is identical. What changed was the counting, the slow accumulation of enough deaths in enough ledgers until the ledgers could no longer be read as anything other than a category. This substance, in these circumstances, does this to people. The counting took a century. The bottle is empty. The prescription pad isn't. The brainstem hasn't changed. And somewhere, right now, someone is taking a dose of something that makes their pain stop and wondering if they'll need it tomorrow and deciding that tomorrow is tomorrow and reaching for the bottle again. They are doing what every laudanum addict in Georgian London did. They are doing what they can. The body's ledger. What chronic opium use actually? Did physicians in the 19th century observe the effects of long-term laudanum use and describe them with careful clinical attention? What they saw, without the mechanisms to explain it, was the body undergoing a systematic transformation, one that modern pharmacology can now read precisely. The most immediately visible change was in the skin. Chronic opioid users developed a distinctive pallor. Not the ruddy complexion of health, not the sallow yellow of liver disease, but a specific whitish-grey tone that experienced physicians learned to recognize. The pupils contracted, often severely, giving the eyes a glassy, unfocused appearance. In high doses, the contractions were so pronounced that the pupils reduced to pinpoints visible in any light. The digestive system suffered profoundly. Opioids inhibit the normal muscular contractions of the intestine. The peristalsis that moves food through the gut and chronic use produces constipation that is not merely inconvenient, but becomes a serious medical condition. De Quincey described this with characteristic precision, noting that the intestinal effects of prolonged opium use created a physical landscape of discomfort that supplemented the psychological distress of his periods of withdrawal. Contemporary physicians treating laudanum patients often spent significant effort managing this secondary condition, prescribing laxatives and enemas that address the symptom without touching the cause. The immune system, we now know, is suppressed by chronic opioid use. Victorian physicians couldn't quantify this. They had no conception of immune function as a physiological category. But they noticed that their laudanum patients seemed particularly susceptible to respiratory infections, that coughs became chronic, that minor illnesses didn't resolve with the expected speed. The tuberculosis that killed so many Victorian invalids and that several famous laudanum users suffered from was partly a disease of poverty and overcrowding. But immune suppression from chronic opioid use may have made those already exposed individuals more vulnerable to the progression of latent infection. The hormonal system was disrupted in ways that Victorian physicians noticed in their female patients without understanding. Chronic opioid use suppresses the production of reproductive hormones, producing menstrual irregularities and eventually amenorrhea, the cessation of menstruation in women taking high doses over long periods. This symptom was recorded with some puzzlement. It was sometimes attributed to the underlying nervous condition that the laudanum had been prescribed to treat, rather than to the treatment itself. And the brain, over years of use, reorganized itself. The opioid receptors that normally respond to the brain's own endorphins became downregulated, fewer in number, less sensitive, producing less response to normal stimulation. This is why the long-term laudanum user felt nothing without their dose. Their brain's natural reward and pleasure systems had been scaled back to accommodate the constant chemical flooding. Without the drug, they were unable to feel pleasure, to experience motivation, to find the ordinary small satisfactions of daily life rewarding in any way. This neurological change was visible in the people around whom it occurred. The family members of long-term laudanum users described a gradual withdrawal of personality, not dramatic, not sudden, but a slow greying out, a diminishing of engagement and enthusiasm, a narrowing of the person to the immediate and the necessary. The intellectual brilliance of a De Quincey became occasional and effortful, where it had once been constant and fluent. The social warmth of a woman who had been a warm presence in her household became intermittent, punctuated by long periods of absence and vacancy. The person was there, but they were running on a fuel that was also burning the engine. What the neighbors knew. Addiction in Georgian domestic space. Laudanum. Addiction in the Georgian and Victorian household was not, in many cases, a secret. It was a known presence, managed by a kind of collective agreement not to name it directly. The servants knew. They were the ones who brought the bottle from the chemist, who refilled it when it was empty, who noticed that the mistress required more now than she had 6 months ago. They were the ones who found her in the morning, in states that ranged from deep sleep to worrying unresponsiveness, who helped her dress on the days she couldn't quite manage alone, who explained to callers that Mrs. Punnymess was not at home today, was unwell today, would perhaps be available tomorrow. The servants' knowledge was constrained by their position. They could observe. They could manage the practical consequences. They could not advise or intervene in any way that their employers would accept. The social distance between mistress and servant in the Victorian household was not primarily spatial. They lived in intimate proximity, but it was absolute in the matter of who could make claims on whom. A servant who expressed concern about the mistress's laudanum use was overstepping in a way that could end their employment. What they knew accumulated silently, in experience rather than words, in the adjustments they made to their routines to accommodate the patterns of the addiction. They knew which days were better and which were worse. They knew the signs of an upcoming difficult episode, the particular quality of restlessness, the way she moved around the house without settling, the look she got around mid-afternoon. They learned to have the kettle hot and the room quiet and the other household members clear when the time came for the evening dose. The children of laudanum-addicted mothers had the most complex knowledge of all, because they were the most dependent on their understanding being accurate. A child who needed something from a mother who had taken a heavy dose had learned, through painful trial and error, that this was not the time to ask. A child who needed emotional response, comfort after a bad dream, attention during illness had learned to calibrate their expectations to the state of the person they needed it from. This calibration is what psychologists now call parentification, the process by which a child takes on adult emotional management responsibilities because the adult in the room is incapable of managing them. Children of addicted parents develop it early and thoroughly. They become experts in emotional weather forecasting. They learn to read the room with an accuracy born of necessity, and they carry this expertise into their adult lives, where it is useful and damaging in equal measure. The households of laudanum-addicted women were not, in most cases, obviously broken. They continued to function. Meals were cooked, children were clothed, visitors were received. The fiction of normality was maintained by the collective effort of servants, older children, and the addicted person herself during her better hours. The fiction was maintained because the alternative acknowledgement of what was happening and its actual name was not available. The addiction was in the house. The house didn't speak its name. The man with the black bag. The doctor's role. No account of the Georgian and Victorian laudanum crisis is complete without reckoning honestly with the role of the physician. The physician was not a villain in this story. He was working with the best knowledge available, prescribing the most effective tool in his kit for a genuine range of human suffering, and doing so within a professional and ethical framework that was genuinely trying to help people. That his prescribing habits created and maintained addiction in a significant portion of his female patients was not something he chose or intended. It was the consequence of having a powerful drug and a limited framework for understanding it. But there is something more to say about the physician's role. Something beyond the excuse of ignorance that is entirely accurate, but not entirely sufficient. The physician was embedded in a social and economic system that had interests in the laudanum prescription. The chemist who sold the laudanum paid a portion of his profits to the physician who directed patients to him, not in the form of direct kickbacks, though those occurred, but in the form of professional relationships that directed business in both directions. The patent medicine manufacturers who profited from opium preparations advertised in medical journals and provided free samples to physicians who might recommend their products. The wealthy patient who needed a physician willing to continue prescribing was a paying customer whose continued custom depended on the physician's prescribing behavior. None of this is conspiracy. It is the ordinary working of a medical marketplace that had no formal rules about the relationship between commercial interests and prescribing decisions. The physician was not being paid to prescribe laudanum. He was being maintained within a professional ecosystem where prescribing laudanum was natural, expected, unchallenged, and commercially reinforced. Some physicians were troubled. John Whitaker, who documented the infant mortality from Godfrey's Cordial. Norman Kerr, who developed the disease model of addiction and campaigned for it in the face of professional resistance. Charles Remington, who quantified the problem in the manufacturing districts. These were minority voices. They were right. They were not, during the period when they were making the argument, prevailing. The majority of their colleagues continued to prescribe. The chemist continued to sell. The manufacturers continued to produce. And the people who needed something for their pain continued to take it, because what else were they supposed to do with their pain? Anne of Oxford Street. The ghost in De Quincey's laudanum. She appears in the Confessions briefly, and she never leaves. Anne was 15 or 16 years old when Thomas de Quincey met her in 1802, the year he ran away from Manchester Grammar School and spent months wandering London in poverty. He was 17. She was a prostitute, already, working Oxford Street. They recognized each other, as they recognized themselves. Two young people, too cold and too hungry, and too far from anything that felt like home. She kept him alive. She gave him food when he had none, and money when he had none, and something that, in the Confessions, he calls friendship, though the word is inadequate to what he describes. She sat with him on the steps of buildings in Oxford Street when he was too weak to walk. She told him things about her life that he found, in the language of his book, too painful to recall. She was someone who chose, in circumstances of poverty and exploitation, to be kind to a stranger who needed it. Then they were separated. A miscommunication about where to meet, and she was gone. He looked for her for years. He described in the Confessions the quality of his searching, the way he scanned Oxford Street every time he returned to London, how he examined every young woman's face in crowded spaces, hoping. He never found her. He did not know what had become of her. He feared, given her circumstances, that she had not survived long. Anne becomes, in the Confessions, the figure around which all the loss of the opium years gathers. The dreams that tormented De Quincey during his worst withdrawal periods were often populated by crowds vast, pressing, undifferentiated, and in those crowds he sometimes glimpsed faces that almost resolved into hers before dissolving. He wrote about this with a grief that his elegant prose cannot quite control, the grief of a man who knows that what he is looking for is gone, that it was gone before he understood what it was. She was not his lover. She was something harder to name. She was the person who had been kind to him at the moment in his life, when kindness was the difference between living and not, and he had lost her. And the opium that followed, the opium he first took for a toothache 2 years after losing her, may have been, in some unmeasurable part, an attempt to fill the particular kind of silence that her disappearance had created. This is speculation. De Quincey wouldn't have put it this way, but the structure of the Confessions makes it available. The loss of Anne, the wandering, the first taste of laudanum, the pleasure that was also clearly a relief from some anterior pain. The connection between grief and self-medication is as old as grief itself. And Anne, whoever she was, wherever she went, is the ghost in the architecture of everything that followed. Her name was probably not Anne. De Quincey changed the names of people in his memoir to protect them, or, in her case, to protect himself from whatever knowing her real name had cost him. The real Anne of Oxford Street, if she survived, lived and died without knowing that the strange, hollow-eyed young man she had fed from her thin purse in the winter of 1802 would make her immortal. She would have had no reason to expect that kind of return on a kindness. Kindness like that rarely gets returned. It just gets remembered by the person who received it for the rest of their life. The child who watched, seeing addiction before it had a name. Imagine growing up in a household where the laudanum bottle was as familiar as the bread knife, where you understood, by the time you were 5 or 6, that mornings were uncertain, that the mother who appeared at breakfast might be the mother who laughed and engaged and noticed things, or the mother who was elsewhere in some way that you couldn't name, who moved through the rooms slowly and smiled at you without quite seeing you, where you knew that when she was in her room with the door closed in the afternoon, you didn't knock, not because she'd told you not to, because you'd learned, where you watched her at the dinner table and learned to read the slope of her shoulders, the quality of her attention, the speed at which she spoke, where you became, by necessity, an expert in a subject that had no name, a reader of signs that no one around you had taught you to read because no one around you was willing to acknowledge that the signs existed. Victorian children in addicted households grew up, generally, in the complete absence of any framework for understanding what they were experiencing. There was no children's literature about parental addiction. There was no school counselor. There was no concept of family disease or secondary trauma or codependency. There was only the daily management of a reality that the adults around you refused to name. What they had instead was the literature. Not books that addressed their situation directly. Those didn't exist, but the novels and stories of the period, which were dense with figures of the damaged household, the mysterious illness, the mother who retreated, the invalid who required management. In Dickens's households, in Wilkie Collins's mystery plots, in Charlotte Bronte's Gothic spaces, the literature of the Victorian era is haunted by the effects of substances on domestic life, even when those substances are not named. The children who grew up in those households and later became writers sometimes put what they had seen into their work in forms that they themselves may not have fully recognized. The mystery plot structure, the hidden truth that explains the visible anomalies. The detective who pieces together what others have refused to see bears more than a passing resemblance to the cognitive work of a child in a household with a secret. The Gothic's obsession with what lies beneath the respectable surface, with the monster hiding in the house, with the decay that polite society refuses to acknowledge. This is not only literary convention. It is lived experience, transposed. The children who watched are gone. The literary forms their watching helped produce are still here. And in those forms, if you know what to look for, you can still see the laudanum bottle on the shelf and the door closed in the afternoon, and the morning face that was never quite predictable. The chemistry of craving. What Victorian physicians couldn't see. There is a moment in opioid addiction that every person who has experienced it can describe, and that no one who hasn't can quite imagine. It is not the moment of taking the drug. It is the moment before the moment, the seconds when you are about to take it, when the craving that has been building for hours reaches its peak and is about to be answered. This moment was described by De Quincey with some of his most precise prose, described by Coleridge in letters, described in the private journals of Victorian invalids who never published them and never intended to. What they were describing, without the words for it, is the activation of the dopamine reward pathway in anticipation of the drug, a neurological event as specific and as powerful as any in human biology. The craving for opioids is not metaphorical. It is not a feeling like a preference or a desire. It is a physiological state in which the body's systems oriented toward survival. The systems that drive hunger, thirst, sexual desire have been co-opted by the drug and are now directing the entire organism toward obtaining it with the same priority and intensity as they would direct toward water in a desert. A Victorian physician looking at a patient in the grip of opioid craving saw someone who was distressed, who was agitated, who could not rest, and insisted upon her medicine. He saw the behavioral surface. He didn't see the dopamine. He didn't see the down-regulated mu receptors. He didn't see that the person in front of him was, at that moment, in a state of neurological emergency that was as physical as a high fever. The inability to see the mechanism produced a failure of empathy that was not personal but conceptual. The physician who told his patient to bear up and exert her will over her laudanum craving was not cruel. He was operating within a model of the human person in which will could, in principle, override bodily demand, because in his model, the bodily demand was not a primary neurological drive, but a bad habit of a weak character. He was wrong about the mechanism and right that something needed to change. The something that needed to change was not the patient's character. It was the understanding. The understanding came slowly. It is still incomplete. The craving that a person in the grip of opioid addiction experiences today is neurologically identical to the craving that a laudanum addict experienced in 1840. The science to explain it is now available. The cultural frameworks around addiction still contain significant residues of the Victorian moral model. We have better words than weakness of will. We haven't entirely stopped using that one. The romantic imagination and the opium architecture. There is a reason that the great romantic poets, Coleridge, De Quincey, Keats, Byron, in his more dissolute periods, are so consistently entangled with opium, and it is not simply that they were weak or dissolute men. It is that opium and romantic aesthetic theory were, in a specific and important way, made for each other. The core project of Romanticism was the exploration and valorization of inner experience, the imagination, the dream, the visionary state, the creative faculty operating at the edge of consciousness. Wordsworth wanted to trace the growth of the poet's mind. Coleridge wanted to find the point where waking imagination and sleeping vision converged. De Quincey wanted to understand the machinery of thought at the level where it became involuntary. Opium, for all its other effects, does something interesting to the visual imagination. In the early stages of use, before tolerance accumulates and before the neurological damage becomes significant, opioids appear to lower the threshold between intentional and involuntary imagery, to make the dreamlike more accessible in waking states, to give the visual imagination a fluency and vividness that ordinary consciousness doesn't provide. Whether Kubla Khan would have been written without the opium, we can't know. What we know is that Coleridge believed the vision came from the opium and described it that way, and that the poem, whatever its pharmacological genesis, is unlike anything else in the language. The Romantic movement, in other words, had aesthetic reasons to be interested in opium that were separate from the physical reasons most people had for taking it. The working-class woman who dosed her baby with Godfrey's Cordial had no interest in the opium dream. She wanted silence. The poet who took laudanum for his toothache and then discovered that it did something to his dreaming had both a physical and an aesthetic investment in the substance. This aesthetic investment produced the extraordinary literary documentation of the laudanum era that we have from the Romantic period. De Quincey's confessions, Coleridge's notebooks, Keats's letters, the poetry of many people who neither published nor preserved their accounts. And it also produced a cultural association between opium and a certain kind of elevated, sensitive, artistic sensibility that proved enormously durable and enormously harmful. The idea that the Romantic artist was necessarily a damaged, self-destructive person, that the wound and the genius were the same wound, that you couldn't have the confessions without the dependency, that you couldn't have Kubla Khan without the habit that interrupted and then prevented its completion. This idea is not only wrong, it is precisely backward. The opium didn't create the genius. It exploited it, borrowed its energy for a time, and then consumed it. De Quincey was extraordinary before laudanum. He remained extraordinary for a time after beginning laudanum, then became more intermittently extraordinary, then became largely incapacitated for long stretches, then recovered partially at enormous effort. The trajectory is what chronic opioid use does to any brain, genius or not. The particular losses, the poems that Coleridge didn't finish, the novels that De Quincey didn't write, the work that was deferred and deferred until the capacity for it was gone, are losses of what would have existed without the drug, not gains that the drug provided. But the aesthetic myth was more comfortable than this reality. And it was also more interesting. An interest in the arts is a more powerful force than accuracy about the arts. The myth persisted. It persists now. And every young person who romanticizes the self-destructive artist, who sees the addiction as inseparable from the work, who thinks the suffering is part of the price of the vision, is, without knowing it, reading from a script that Thomas De Quincey wrote and that the pharmacology of opioids made catastrophically persuasive. The price of laudanum. What addiction cost in shillings laudanum was cheap initially. This was fundamental to its penetration across class lines. Unlike many Victorian medications and treatments that were priced beyond the reach of the poor, laudanum was accessible to almost everyone. A pennyworth of laudanum, available at most chemists and at many general stores, was sufficient for several doses for an adult. A bottle large enough to last a small family several weeks cost only a few shillings. For the working-class household, this was the initial appeal. Laudanum was within budget in a way that a physician's consultation was not, in a way that even relatively cheap patent medicines sometimes were not. The single penny dose that quieted a baby, or managed a headache, or got a factory worker through a shift, was accessible to a woman whose weekly wages might be 10 shillings. But addiction changes the arithmetic completely. The dose that produced effect in the first week of use was insufficient by the third month. The penny dose became the 3-penny dose, became the 6-penny dose, as tolerance accumulated. A working-class woman who had begun with a single pennyworth per week was, 2 years later, spending a significant fraction of her wages on laudanum before she understood what had happened to the budget. This economic spiral was one of the ways that laudanum addiction was most visible in working-class communities, and it was visible specifically in the household accounts that working-class budgetary investigators sometimes had access to. When a family's spending on chemist preparations exceeded their spending on food, a pattern noted in several social investigations of the 1850s and 1860s, something had gone wrong in a way that ordinary poverty didn't explain. For middle-class and upper-class addicts, the cost was less immediately ruinous, but still significant. De Quincey's financial chaos, he was constantly in debt, constantly borrowing, constantly moving to escape creditors, was overdetermined by several factors, including his disorganized work habits and his difficulty completing projects. But laudanum at 8,000 drops per day was not cheap, and the costs of his habit were not separable from his inability to manage his finances with the discipline that ordinary financial life required. The costs were not only monetary, they were temporal. The hours spent in the haze of heavy doses, the hours spent in the misery of insufficient doses, the hours that should have gone to work or care or relationship that went to managing the chemistry of the addiction were hours that didn't come back. It was social, the relationship strained by unreliability, by the withdrawal of personality, by the growing centrality of the drug and the receding centrality of everything else. They were physical. The body's resources, redirected to managing the addiction, were not available for the ordinary maintenance and repair of a healthy organism. The cheap penny dose had turned, by imperceptible degrees, into one of the most expensive things a person could do to themselves. The cost arrived late and all at once, and by the time it arrived, there was no obvious way to stop paying it. What the inquest found: coroners, deaths, and the silence of the record. The Victorian coroner was an important figure in the medical and legal geography of death. In cases of sudden, unexpected, or suspicious death, the coroner was empowered to hold an inquest to examine witnesses, hear medical testimony, and arrive at a verdict explaining the cause of death. Laudanum deaths came before coroners regularly. Infant deaths after Godfrey's Cordial. Women found unresponsive with empty bottles. Men who had taken a dose too large, by accident or design, and not woken up. The coroner had to determine what happened here and how. The verdicts in laudanum cases revealed the full complexity of the social dynamics surrounding the drug. Accidental death was the most common finding in cases where the deceased had an established habit, because the habit was medicinal, because the overdose was plausible as a miscalculation, because the alternative verdict was suicide, and suicide was both a crime and a shame that the family did not deserve if any other explanation was possible. Found dead was sometimes used when the circumstances didn't clearly indicate the cause and no one present had particularly pressing reasons to investigate further. This verdict required nothing, no mechanism, no responsibility, no conclusion about whether what happened was accident, intent, or neglect. Negligence rarely appeared in laudanum inquest verdicts, even in infant deaths where the connection between Godfrey's Cordial and the death was medically evident. The social and commercial interests surrounding laudanum were sufficiently powerful to ensure that the logical conclusion that the product killed the child, and that the manufacturer and seller of the product bore some responsibility, was almost never reached in a legal forum. What the inquest record shows, read in aggregate, is not a system processing the deaths that laudanum caused. It is a system generating paperwork that obscured them. The verdicts were chosen for the social functions they served, protecting families from scandal, protecting manufacturers from liability, protecting physicians from professional accountability rather than for their accuracy. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of how legal and social systems behave when confronted with a cause of death that the dominant institutions of the society have reasons not to pursue. The physicians who testified at inquests were the same physicians prescribing laudanum. The chemists who sold it were members of communities that had no interest in their neighbors' businesses being scrutinized. The manufacturers who produced the patent medicines were customers of the newspapers that had no financial interest in investigating them. The silence in the record is not empty. It is full. It is the shape of a specific, structured, socially produced refusal to count. And in the space of that refusal, the deaths continued, uncounted, until the count became impossible to avoid. The sound of addiction. What Victorian households heard history tends to be visual. We have paintings, engravings, photographs from the later period. We can look at Georgian and Victorian England and see what people wore, what their houses looked like, what the streets looked like. Sound is harder. What did a Victorian house sound like when the laudanum began to take effect in the evening? It got quieter. That is probably the most consistent thing. The general domestic noise of a Victorian household, children being noisy, servants working, conversation, the movement of people through rooms, had a characteristic evening diminuendo as people prepared for bed. In a household with a laudanum-addicted member, this diminuendo arrived earlier and was more complete. The addicted person went still, settled in a chair, or went to bed. The children, learning the pattern, learned to lower their volume around this event. The servants, also knowing the pattern, moved more softly. The house organized itself around the stillness. De Quincey described the quality of laudanum's effect on his own consciousness as one of profound silence in his emotional life, the cessation of all the ordinary anxieties and annoyances and minor frictions of existence. He could hear music more clearly, he reported. He could appreciate architecture in a heightened way. but he existed in a kind of auditory and emotional distance from ordinary stimulation that allowed him to observe without being affected by what he observed. This auditory distance is what the households around the laudanum-addicted person experienced from the outside. The person who had been present emotionally reactive, responsive to the household's emotional weather, became distant. They were in the room, but the room was quieter for their presence in it than for their absence. Coleridge's son Hartley, who grew up watching his father's addiction, wrote late in his own life about the particular quality of silence in his father's study, the way the room seemed to absorb sound, to cushion it somehow, to make even the domestic noises of a household seem far away. He was describing, without the framework for it, the way that a house accommodates itself to one of its members having checked out. Sound is how we track each other's presence. The baby who goes quiet is being checked. The household that goes quiet around its addicted member is doing the same thing, monitoring in the oldest way available whether the person is still there. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they weren't. The Victorian novel and the hidden bottle. Wilkie Collins wrote The Moonstone in 1868. He wrote The Woman in White in 1859. He wrote Armadale in 1866. Across all three novels, he explores, with varying degrees of directness, the theme of the unreliable self. The person who cannot trust their own perception, whose consciousness is in some way compromised, whose version of events cannot be taken at face value. In The Moonstone, the central mystery turns on the fact that the detective and the criminal are the same person, that someone did something terrible in a state they have no memory of. That consciousness and action can be dissociated in ways that make moral responsibility unclear. This was not purely a literary device. It was Collins working through, in fictional form, his own experience of writing in a laudanum haze and discovering, in the proofs, what he had done. In The Woman in White, the villain's plot depends on undermining a woman's legal identity, having her declared legally non-existent, institutionalized, erased as a person from the legal and social record. The woman's ability to assert her own sanity and her own identity against a system that has decided to deny it is the plot's central drama. The experience of a person trying to maintain their selfhood against a substance and an addiction that erodes selfhood is not precisely the same thing, but the fear at the center of both narratives, the fear of losing the thread of who you are, of waking up and finding that the self has been misplaced, is recognizable. Victorian fiction is haunted by this fear because Victorian society was full of situations that generated it. The laudanum-addicted woman who woke each morning unsure of how the previous evening had passed. The man who found gaps in his memory, hours he couldn't account for. The person who knew, in some abstract way, that they were not the person they had been and were not sure how to find their way back. The novel gave this fear a narrative home. It gave it plot, a beginning, a middle, and generally a resolution that real addiction did not provide. The detectives solved the crime. The identity was restored. The villain was unmasked. In the real houses of Victorian England, there was often no resolution of this kind, no unmasking, no single moment when the truth was revealed and the harm could begin to be repaired. The novel was more comfortable than the reality. That is one of the things novels are for. The geography of laudanum. From poppy field to brown bottle. The laudanum bottle at the Victorian chemists was the final stop on a supply chain of extraordinary length and complexity. It began in the poppy fields of Bengal, where the East India Company had organized production into a precisely managed system. Farmers were contracted to grow poppies, sometimes without real choice. In the matter, the company's land control meant that refusal had consequences. The poppies were harvested by hand at dawn, the seed pods lanced with small knives, the sap collected as it beaded and dried on the pod's surface. This sap raw opium was gathered, weighed, compressed into balls, and wrapped in poppy leaves for transport to the company's processing facilities. At the processing facilities, most famously at Patna and Ghazipur, both of which are still operating today as the world's largest legal opium processing plants, the raw opium was refined, purified, and compressed into chests. Each chest contained about 140 pounds of opium. The chests were auctioned to private merchants, who loaded them onto ships in Calcutta. The ships carried the chests to China, primarily, or to other Asian markets. A portion of the crop smaller than the export to China, but significant, went to Britain and Europe, where it supplied the pharmaceutical industry. British manufacturers purchased raw opium and processed it into laudanum, into paregoric, into Dover's powder, and the dozens of other opiate preparations that stocked the Victorian chemist's shelf. The distance from a poppy field in Bengal to a chemist's shelf in London was approximately 7,000 miles. It crossed 3 oceans. It passed through the hands of Indian farmers, Company agents, Calcutta merchants, ship's captains, London importers, pharmaceutical manufacturers, and finally the chemist, who measured the dose and handed it over the counter. What was common to every link in this chain was that someone was paid. The farmer who grew the poppy was paid poorly. The merchant who shipped the opium was paid well. The manufacturer who processed it was paid. The chemist who sold it was paid. The only people in the chain who weren't paid were the people whose bodies processed the drug and were changed by it. They paid in a different currency. The distance also meant that the human cost at one end of the chain was invisible to the people at the other end. The Bengali farmer who grew the poppy had no way of knowing that his crop would become the soothing syrup in an English baby's crib. The English mother who gave that syrup to her baby had no way of knowing that it had crossed 7,000 miles of ocean to reach her shelf. The invisibility was structural, and it served the interests of everyone in the middle of the supply chain. This structure, an extractive supply chain whose costs are concentrated at the endpoints and whose profits accumulate in the middle, is not specific to opium. It is the basic architecture of colonial economics, applied here to a substance whose particular properties made its costs especially difficult to see and count and assign. The writing that addiction destroyed, the books that were never written. Let us count what was lost. Coleridge, at the height of his powers in his early 30s, projected a major philosophical work he called the Opus Maximum, a comprehensive work of metaphysics that would synthesize German idealism with English empiricism and arrive at something new. He worked on it for decades. It exists in fragments. The complete version was never written. His letters from the middle period of his life are full of references to it, full of plans and outlines and pieces he'd completed, full of apologies for the delays, full of the specific quality of a man who can see exactly what he wants to do and cannot make his hands do it. De Quincey, by his own account, had the intellectual material for dozens of books that never came to fruition. He was one of the most widely read men of his era, in German philosophy, in classical literature, in mathematics, in political economy. The essays he published were brilliant, and also fragmentary, partial, interrupted. What he might have produced with consistent access to his full faculties. What the man who at 17 walked across Wales and wrote letters of extraordinary sophistication might have produced at 40 and 50 we cannot know. What we know is what was actually written, and it is considerably less than the mind behind it could have produced. Collins's later novel, Poor Miss Finch, 1872, The Evil Genius, 1886, Blind Love, 1890, finished posthumously, have their moments of the old brilliance and long passages of something that feels like working from memory of how to write rather than writing. The detective's eye that had made the Moonstone so extraordinary is intermittently present, then gone. His close readers have traced the trajectory of his decline with something like grief, because the talent was so evident and the decline so specifically correlated with his increasing dependency, and there is no question what was being lost and why. This is the true account of what the drug does to genius, as opposed to the romantic account. The drug doesn't produce genius. It borrows from it. It spends the capital. It gives you, for a time, what feels like access to something extraordinary, the fluency, the openness, the dreaming quality. And while you're spending it, you don't notice that the capital is being depleted. Then one day, you reach for what was there before and find the account is lower, and lower again. And eventually what remains is enough to function, but not enough to produce what the full resources of the undamaged brain could have produced. What we are left with, the actual literary record, is beautiful and broken and truncated, and enough to make the loss visible. Enough Kubla Khan to know what the rest might have been. Enough of the brilliant, comprehensive intelligence of De Quincey to know what a full De Quincey might have produced. Enough of Collins to see, precisely, the point where the needle moved and everything after became harder. What it smelled like. The sensory life of laudanum. Use laudanum has a smell. It is a complex smell. The alcohol of its solvent, combined with the particular organic chemistry of opium alkaloids, which produce a heavy, slightly sweet, earthy note. It is not an unpleasant smell to most people. If you encountered it without knowing what it was, you might describe it as medicinal in the old sense. Not the antiseptic hospital smell of modern medicine, but something older, more herbal, more complicated. In Victorian homes where laudanum was regularly used, this smell was present. In the medicine cabinet, certainly the bottle was there. In the bedroom of the person who used it most. In the fabric of the furniture near where they sat most often. In the slight heaviness of the air in a room where someone had been taking a large dose and was now sleeping deeply. The children in those houses would have known this smell intimately, without necessarily knowing what they knew. The association between this smell and a certain quality of the house, a certain stillness, a certain dimming of the adult presence would have been established early and remained permanently. It is the kind of olfactory memory that doesn't require names. It precedes names. It is simply what certain times smelled like, attached to everything that those times contained. The smell of opium is what Limehouse smelled like to Charles Dickens when he went there to research his fiction. He described it, the sweet heaviness of the air in the den, the smoke, the particular quality of the silence around the sleeping bodies. He found it disgusting and fascinating simultaneously, and the literary use he made of it depends on both reactions. The horror of the degraded scene and the difficulty of looking away. The same smell, in a different context, a wealthy household, a medicine cabinet, a carefully maintained drawing room would have prompted entirely different responses. Not horror, not fascination, simply recognition. The smell of what was in the bottle on the shelf, in the quantity that was usual, at the time that was normal. The smell of medicine, the smell of quiet, the smell of the evening settling. After laudanum, the shadows it left. The laudanum era ended, more or less, by the early 20th century. The Pharmacy Act of 1868, tightened in subsequent decades, required prescription for opiates. The Harrison Act in America criminalized the trade. The patent medicine industry faced increasing regulatory scrutiny and was forced, over time, to remove opiates from products marketed to children and to disclose their ingredients. The addiction that laudanum had created didn't end with the drug's availability. It transformed. People who had been using laudanum for decades didn't stop because the law changed. They found heroin, which was being sold in pharmacies well into the 1920s as a non-addictive substitute. They found morphine injection, which was initially less controlled than oral opiates. They found the black market that developed as legal markets closed. The pharmacology didn't change. The source changed. And the people who couldn't find substitutes went through withdrawal in an era that had made no provision for the treatment of withdrawal, in a legal environment that was moving toward criminalizing the addict rather than treating them. The Ralston Committee in Britain 1926 provided some protection, recommending that physicians maintain addicts on stable doses. But this was medical policy, not universal practice, and it reached a fraction of the people who needed it. The shadows that the laudanum era cast were long. They stretched into the heroin crises of the 20th century, into the pharmaceutical opioid crises of the 21st century, into every emergency room in every Western country where a person in opioid withdrawal is treated by a medical system that has better language than its Victorian predecessors, but is still, in fundamental ways, improvising around the same pharmacological reality. The poppy is still growing. The molecule is still the same. The brainstem has not changed. And the question that the laudanum era posed, and that no subsequent era has conclusively answered, is still there. How do you give relief to people who are genuinely suffering without creating a different suffering that lasts longer and is harder to treat than the first? The Victorians gave laudanum and discovered the answer was not that. The early 20th century gave criminalization and discovered the answer was not that either. The late 20th century gave managed prescription access and discovered that the pharmaceutical industry could recreate the laudanum crisis with better marketing. The question is still open. The bottle is waiting for the next answer. The men who weren't counted. Working class male addiction. The twin dominant images of Victorian laudanum addiction, the romantic genius and the invalid lady, have a third figure largely missing from the historical narrative. The working man. Not the intellectual who aestheticized his dependency. Not the middle-class woman whose physician prescribed hers. The man who worked a physically brutal job, whose body accumulated damage from a working life in conditions that produced chronic pain as a matter of course, and who found in laudanum the same thing everyone else found: temporary relief from something otherwise unrelievable. Men who worked in the lead mines of the Mendips, producing the very lead that went into so many of laudanum's supply chains, developed chronic musculoskeletal injuries. Miners, navvies building the railway lines that were transforming Britain, foundry workers, dockers, agricultural labourers doing harvest work, all of them were subject to the kind of physical wear that, by their 30s and 40s, produced the chronic joint and muscle pain for which laudanum was the obvious remedy. The working-class male addict didn't write memoirs. He didn't produce confessions or literary analyses of his experience. His name appears, if at all, in the records of the coroner's court, or in the notes of the social investigators who occasionally ventured into the courts and alleys of industrial Britain to document what was living there. The investigator notes a man of middle age, much given to laudanum, unable to work, and moves on to the next entry. The quantitative scale of working-class male laudanum use is difficult to establish precisely because the recording systems weren't designed to capture it as a category. What we know is that laudanum was cheap enough to be accessible, that the physical conditions of working-class industrial labor produced the kind of pain that laudanum addressed, and that the chemists' records from districts with large working-class populations show patterns of purchase consistent with significant habitual use. The moral calculus applied to these men was different from the one applied to De Quincey or to the invalid woman. The working-class man who couldn't work because of laudanum was not a tragic genius or an invalid. He was a failure, a burden, a moral cautionary tale. His addiction was evidence of the general weakness and improvidence of the working class, rather than a specific pharmaceutical consequence of a specific drug, doing what it always did to any nervous system it sufficiently occupied. This moral differentiation was not evidence-based. The laudanum doing its work in a mine worker's body was doing the same thing as the laudanum in De Quincey's body. The tolerance accumulated the same way. The withdrawal felt the same. The dose needed to maintain function grew the same way. The only difference was the narrative framework surrounding it. The mine worker's name isn't in any book. His experience didn't get published. But his nervous system was doing exactly what De Quincey's nervous system was doing, for the same pharmacological reasons, producing the same result. The molecule doesn't know who is holding the bottle. De Quincey at 74. The final account. In the autumn of 1859, Thomas De Quincey was dying. He was 73 years old, living in a house in Edinburgh that he had occupied for several years with the daughters who looked after him. A domestic arrangement made necessary by the same difficulty with money and organization that had characterized his entire adult life. He was still writing in the intervals between incapacity. He was still brilliant in the intervals between the laudanum. He had first taken it 55 years earlier for a toothache in 1804. He had spent those 55 years in a relationship with the drug that had gone through every phase imaginable. The early pleasure, the first tolerance, the first failed attempts to stop, the years of heavy use at extraordinary doses, the periods of partial reduction achieved at enormous effort, the relapse, the reduction again, the stabilization at levels that allowed some function, the gradual decline. His body had organized itself around the drug so thoroughly and for so long that the question of who he would have been without it, the question of the life and work that would have existed in the absence of those 8,000 daily drops, was unanswerable. He had written the most influential first-person account of opioid addiction in the English language. He had written it when he was 36 years old, and everything he described had continued to be true for the next 37 years. The tolerance he described had continued to grow. The withdrawal he described had continued to threaten whenever reduction was attempted. The dreams he described, the vast architectural nightmares, the crowds, the faces he was looking for and never finding had continued, with the reliability of a condition that doesn't resolve, only continue. The laudanum had not killed him in the way it killed Elizabeth Siddal, or in the way it killed the infants in the Godfrey's Cordial cribs. It had simply become the baseline of his existence, the floor below which he could not descend without his body catastrophically failing, the ceiling above which additional doses produced no additional benefit. He was not in constant agony. He was not in constant pleasure. He was maintaining, in the specific physiological sense, consuming enough of the drug to prevent the nervous system it had colonized from revolting against its absence. He died on 8 December 1859. The cause of death listed was debility. It was the same word listed for a significant number of deaths in the Victorian records, where the actual cause was more complicated. One of those useful, expansive words that contains everything and explains nothing. What followed after De Quincey, after Siddal, after Collins and Coleridge and all the others was silence of a particular kind. Not the silence of the problem having been resolved, the silence of the record having caught up with itself. The 20th century would provide new words for what had happened, new frameworks, new understanding of the mechanism. It would also provide new versions of the same crisis, new drugs, new casualties. And somewhere in the poppy fields of Bengal or Afghanistan or Laos, the poppy is still growing. It has been growing without interruption since before there was a word for what it produces in the people who consume it. It doesn't know what it's doing. It's a flower. The knowing and the not knowing and the choosing what to do with what we know, that part is ours. Every person in this story was trying to solve a problem that was real. The mother with the Godfrey's Cordial was trying to get through a day that was genuinely impossible. The poet with the laudanum bottle was trying to manage a pain, internal or external, that ordinary existence hadn't equipped him to bear. The physician who prescribed it was trying to help someone who was suffering. The chemist who sold it was doing his job in good faith. The manufacturer who made it was selling what worked. The drug worked. That was never the question. It worked every time, right up until the moment. It didn't until the dose that had maintained function yesterday was insufficient today, until the life built around the drug's requirements had become the life with nothing left beside it. This is still happening. Somewhere tonight, in a bedroom in a city in a country with modern medicine and modern pharmacology and modern understanding of addiction's mechanism, someone is taking a dose of something that makes their pain stop. They're not thinking about De Quincey. They're not thinking about the infants who went quiet in the Godfrey's Cordial cribs. They're thinking about the pain that is, right now, not happening. Tomorrow, the dose will be the same, or a little more. The brown bottle is long gone from the chemist's shelf, but the brown bottle was never the point. The laudanum that built Britain. There is an argument uncomfortable, but historically grounded, that the Industrial Revolution was partly powered by laudanum, not metaphorically, literally. The working conditions of early industrial Britain were beyond what a human nervous system was designed to sustain. 12 to 14 hours in a cotton mill, breathing fibre. 14 hours in a foundry at temperatures that should have been impossible. Night shifts, rotating shift. The abolition of natural light and natural rhythm that factory work imposed on bodies that had evolved to work and rest and work again in accordance with the sun. Those bodies needed something. They needed the pain to stop, the anxiety to quiet, the exhausted sleeplessness to resolve. And they had, for a penny, the most effective available solution. The laudanum that mill workers took to get through their shifts went into the productivity that made their employers wealthy, and their employers' wealthy, and the wealth of nations measurable in ways that economists could write about with admiration. The cotton that was spun by laudanum maintained hands, became the cloth that was sold across the empire. The iron that was smelted by laudanum maintained foundry workers, became the railway lines that connected an increasingly powerful industrial economy. The people who maintained those industries, with their maintained bodies, were not compensated for the use of the drug. They were not offered alternative. They were offered the choice between working and not working, which in an economy without safety nets was not much of a choice. And to work, in those conditions, many of them needed something that made the working bearable. The laudanum economy was inside the industrial economy, hidden but structural. The profits went to the manufacturers and the factory owners and the East India Company and the patent medicine industry. The costs, the addiction, the dependency, the destroyed nervous systems, the early deaths, the children given Godfrey's Cordial while their mothers completed the shift were carried by the people whose ladle was being extracted. This is the full picture of what laudanum was in Britain between 1750 and 1900. Not only a medicine, not only an addiction, not only a literary subject, an instrument of industrial productivity, subsidized by the bodies of the people it was used on, a hidden cost of the empire, passed on to those least able to refuse it. The Industrial Revolution built the modern world. The modern world doesn't mention, much, what was in the worker's bottle.